Story 1. Social life is not something that can be called successful in my life. Each year as I got older, I felt my social connections disintegrating more and more. In university, everything seemed simpler. We met almost every day, discussed things, planned weekend outings, and were always in the center of events. But over the years, something changed, and I began to notice that the connections with friends were starting to fade. People moved to different cities, went to work in other countries, started to build their own lives, and I found myself alone in the place that was once my home in terms of social activity. Many of my friends live in other parts of the country. We always kept in touch, but our communication became less frequent. Sometimes I tried to organize something, invited them to my city, or offered to come to me, but our schedules always diverged. Some had work, some had a family, some had moved to another city and did not have time for old friends. And I myself could not say that I spent my days any differently. Staying in one city, I began to feel how my life was drawn into a vicious circle of loneliness and routine. My work schedule wasn't conducive to making new acquaintances either. Every year it became more and more difficult to agree with those who were nearby. My friends who lived nearby also had their own concerns, work, personal life, problems that they sometimes didn't want to talk about. It seemed like I was nearby, but at the moment when we needed to meet, we were all busy. Our schedules never coincided, and I began to feel how these invisible barriers were getting stronger with each passing month. It's been like this for a few years now. It's not that I haven't seen my friends, but there have been months where I've gone almost 4 to 6 months without seeing them. And when I think about it, it makes me a little sad. Sometimes I thought it was just a phase in life, that things would eventually go back to normal. But with each passing year, it's become harder to find the time and energy to renew old connections. Just sitting with a friend over a cup of coffee seemed almost impossible. Sometimes I forced myself to think that maybe this was normal, that age, work, adult concerns were something that inevitably came, and that my friends were going through something similar. But what upset me most was that I increasingly felt lonely. It was not as direct and obvious as in childhood, but as soon as I found myself at home on my rare free days, I began to realize that there was no one to share this time with. No evening get-togethers, no chance meetings in a cafe or on the street. Over time, more and more people stopped appearing in my life, and their places were taken by affairs and obligations. When I started to analyze how this affected my relationship with my girlfriend, I realized that this also played a role. We had been dating for almost 4 years, and it would seem that such trivial things as meeting with friends should not be a problem. But in reality, my rare meetings with friends became something that I had to justify every time I could not be there. I was looking for a balance, but I did not always manage to find it. While my girlfriend maintained active relationships with several groups of friends, for me this became a problem. She did not have the same restrictions that I had. She would meet with friends almost every week, although not always in full, but always felt like part of some group. And although I understood that this was normal, that she had support, I still began to feel like an exception. But she did not understand why it was so difficult for me to organize meetings, why, despite the rare opportunities, I did not strive to take advantage of them. At first, it didn't bother me too much. I was happy for her that she had a stable social life, that she could spend time with friends, go to events with them, and stay active. However, as the years went by, I began to feel like our worlds were becoming more and more different. She continued to live her life in her own rhythm, where her friends were a part of her life, and I was increasingly immersed in my work and personal problems. It became increasingly difficult for me to find a balance between being a good friend and a good partner. I began to think that maybe I should also actively seek out people to date and keep in touch with, but it was difficult to take that first step. When I thought about my relationship with my girlfriend, I remembered how simple everything was at first. Then we could spend a lot of time together, discuss any topic, walk in the park, or just sit in a cafe and chat. But now when she was spending more and more time with her friends and I was becoming more and more isolated, I had no choice but to stay in my usual territory. It was not very noticeable on the surface, but I felt that something was starting to pull me towards loneliness. We talked less and less about what was happening in our lives and shared our experiences less and less. Somehow I kept thinking that maybe the situation would change, that I would find a way to be part of some active social life again. But deep down, I knew that the situation would only get worse if I did nothing. I needed to make a decision, to change my perception of how I saw my relationships with others and with her. And maybe if I could just find that middle ground, it would help me bridge the gap between our worlds. But at that point, all I could do was feel everything slipping away from me. That was my problem. It became more and more obvious as time went on. I knew I couldn't just let it go. All these thoughts and feelings that had been building up in my head had to come out. I couldn't ignore how much it was bothering me anymore. Even though I wanted to believe that the problem with my social life was just a temporary phase, it was far from it. It wasn't temporary, and this feeling was starting to destroy not only my inner world, but also my relationship with my girlfriend. Her constant activity with her friends was not unusual for me. I knew that it was important for her to maintain such connections. She had always been a person who could easily make friends and maintain relationships with them. It was as natural to her as breathing. And I didn't think it would be a problem for me until it became so obvious. I was kind of happy that she had friends, that she didn't feel lonely, but the more time she spent with them, the more I began to feel in the background. I always knew that she valued her friends, that it was important to her, but I never thought that it would become a reason for a quarrel between us. When I suggested to her that I would have several meetings with friends this month, I did not expect that it would lead to a conflict. All I wanted was to be honest with her, to share my plans, not to hide anything, as usual. I told her that this month was special for me, that meeting with friends is a rarity, and I needed to have time to meet those whom I had not seen for many years. But apparently this did not suit her. When I told her that I couldn't spend the entire month with her because I had plans with friends, I saw her face change. It was almost imperceptible, but I felt the tension in her eyes. She asked why I couldn't change my plans, why I couldn't give up hanging out with my friends for her. In that moment, I realized that the expectations she had for my actions were much higher than I could have imagined. I didn't think that for her, hanging out with friends was anything more than a pleasant pastime. It wasn't just time she spent with someone else. It was time she considered necessary, as important as breathing. And I guess I should have realized that. At the time, I still didn't understand what she wanted from me. Why was it so important to her that I cancel my plans? Why couldn't she just understand that it was important to me too, to see friends I hadn't seen in years? I tried to explain that it was rare, that I could rarely arrange to see people I cared about. But she couldn't understand my point of view. To her, I had to be with her. Everything else, including my old friendships, seemed less important to her. And that surprised me. I couldn't help but notice that her words were increasingly sounding like accusations. She was saying that I didn't put her first, that I didn't care about spending time with her, that I thought about my friends first. It was hard to take. I had always tried to maintain our relationship, always tried to find time for her, but not at the expense of other people. After all, friendship is an important part of life too, especially when you have friends you haven't seen in a long time. Why couldn't she understand that? I realized that the problem wasn't really that I was spending time with my friends. The problem was how she perceived it. To her, any time I spent with someone else felt like a betrayal, and I began to wonder, how did I get into this situation? Why was it so important to her that I cancel my plans to be with her? What did she expect from me? Maybe I was wrong to not take her feelings into account. Maybe I should have prepared her in advance for my busy schedule that month and offered her something in return. But I also felt like I couldn't keep canceling my plans to accommodate her demands. I didn't want to be the person who always had to choose between her and my friends. I didn't want my every move to be scrutinized and assessed to see if it met her expectations. I tried day after, we spent less and less time together, and frankly, I didn't know how to fix this situation. Every time I started to think that she understood me, she would again declare that she felt secondary. These words sounded like a death sentence. They made me doubt myself. Did I really matter to her, or was all this just a temporary convenience for her until she found something more suitable? I could not find the answers to these questions. With each passing day, I realized more and more that the conflict that had arisen between us was not simply the result of a few meetings with friends. It was the result of something deeper. Perhaps I had not been as attentive to her needs as I thought. Perhaps I had been thinking too much about my plans, my feelings, without paying enough attention to her experiences. In addition to these doubts, I began to feel our intimacy fading away due to our disagreements. Each conversation became increasingly cold and distant, as if we were both building walls between ourselves without even realizing it. I couldn't understand why she took my plans with friends as a personal betrayal. I hadn't canceled our meetings or abandoned our conversations. I had continued to maintain our relationship, but it didn't seem enough. It seemed important to her that I choose between my friends and her, and every time I chose not to cancel, I felt her withdraw further. Often I wondered if I was doing the right thing by not giving in to these demands. Shouldn't I have put her first? I looked within myself for answers, but instead of clarifying the situation, it only became more confusing. I kept telling myself that I had the right to my own relationships and relationships with my friends, but every time I said those words, I felt her turn away again. I was tormented by the thought that perhaps I had been approaching our communication incorrectly all this time. There are moments in life when it is not what you say that is more important than how you say it. It could be that I did not give her enough time to feel important to me. She was also going through a difficult period in her life, and perhaps I failed to understand in time that for her all these feelings and experiences were more important than anything else. The problems that arose between us were not caused by a single event. They were the result of accumulated misunderstandings and expectations that we had not discussed in a timely manner. I looked to her for support when I was having a hard time, and perhaps I expected her to do the same. But in practice, things were not that simple. The expectations I had for her did not match what she expected from me. And so I found myself in a situation where I did not know what was more important to her, our connection or her circle of friends. She could understand that I also needed time for myself, but this required accepting that I, too, had the right to my own life outside of our relationship. My friend whom I was planning to meet noticed that I was not my usual self. He offered to talk to me as soon as I arrived. He was the person who could give me an outside perspective, without emotions and bias. Perhaps this was the point where I needed to hear the truth that I had been avoiding for so long. I increasingly wondered what I expected from this relationship. Should I change my habits, my priorities, for the sake of making her happy? Or did I still have the right to my own interests and space? My girlfriend and I hadn't talked about our feelings for a long time, hadn't had honest conversations about what was important to us. We each lived our own lives, and when our different worlds collided, it seemed like we didn't understand each other. I thought that everything would work out, that we would both be able to understand each other, but the more I tried to find a compromise, the more I felt like we were drifting apart. The relationship took effort, but perhaps I was leaning too heavily on habits that weren't always healthy. After all, no one can be the center of everyone else's expectations all the time without having their own space. But when I said this, she immediately began to perceive my words as excuses. This was the paradox of our relationship. As I tried to open up, I increasingly felt that it only exacerbated our differences. We weren't talking about what was really important, and now it had painful consequences. And so, standing on the threshold of a new day, with thoughts that did not give me peace, I found myself at a moment when I had to choose what was more important: to continue to defend my boundaries, or perhaps to take a step forward and try to understand what was important to her. The next time I saw my friend, I told him about our situation. He listened attentively, without interrupting, and, as always, was quite straightforward in his assessments. He said that I was trapped, a trap of compromises that seemed necessary to maintain harmony in the relationship, but in fact destroyed its essence. We all want to please each other, especially when there are feelings, and each of us tries to find a balance between personal desires and what the other person requires. But sometimes this balance is not so stable. We both became hostages of our expectations. I expected her to understand why these meetings with friends were important to me. She expected me to put her needs and desires first because for her, our connection was the center of everything. When I got home, I felt a heaviness in my chest. That conversation with my friend had given me something I hadn't noticed in a long time. I had lost the sense that I mattered. That weird feeling of mounting pressure when you don't know what to do with yourself, with other people, and with what's really important to you. I began to understand that our conflict wasn't just a mundane misunderstanding. It was a fight over priorities, over who was in charge in this relationship. I didn't understand why it had to be so difficult. Every time I tried to express my feelings and say that I couldn't cancel plans with friends, I felt like I was being pressured. And here I was, in a situation where my feelings weren't being taken seriously. I really wanted her to understand that she was as important to me as I was to my own needs. But whenever I voiced my opinion, she would defend it just as fiercely. We both defended our positions, but neither heard the other. It was like a fight where each of us was defending something elusive and at the same time very important. I tried to think about what exactly needed to be done to resolve this situation. I really didn't want our relationship to be destroyed over something that could have been resolved differently. I knew we needed to compromise, but the question was, who would be willing to sacrifice more to restore harmony? It gradually became clear to me that I was starting to close off. It was hard for me to find the strength to continue fighting for this relationship if every step towards the other person turned into another conflict. I could see how my decisions and behavior were becoming more and more calculated rather than based on feelings. I became more withdrawn, started to close in on myself, because every time I tried to open up, I found that my words did not get through to her. I told myself that this would be the last time I tried to explain something if it was not received. Her reactions to my words continued to hurt. When she insisted that I didn't put her first, I felt the turmoil building inside me. I tried to explain that I wanted to see her happy, but I couldn't stop seeing the pressure in that. I searched for explanations in her words, trying to figure out what was important to her. And every time I thought I finally understood what to do, she would return to the accusation that I didn't pay enough attention to her. This vicious circle became more and more noticeable. I felt like I was becoming more and more of a stranger to myself, trying to figure out how to find the right path in this relationship. The relationship I valued so much began to feel like a daily struggle. I found myself in a situation where every step I took could lead to a new conflict. I could no longer tell exactly where I ended and where her expectations began. Throughout this whole situation, I found myself wondering what would have happened if I had just let go of all these thoughts and gone along with her plans, canceling my social gatherings. Maybe I would have been happier if I had accommodated her demands by putting my life on hold, or maybe I would have been even more miserable, sacrificing my space and personal interests just to please her. This question haunted me. I tried again and again to find the right answer, but perhaps the problem was not in making a choice, but in understanding what was important to both of us in a relationship. I increasingly felt that if we could not find a way to understand each other, this relationship would not be able to withstand all the strain. In my search for compromise, I did not find what I expected. I was looking for harmony, but every step I took in its direction led to a new conflict. My task became clear. I had to make a choice. I didn't know what the right decision would be, but one thing was clear. If we didn't start talking openly about our feelings and needs, our relationship would be on the verge of destruction. As time went on, I couldn't stop thinking about how things would end if my girlfriend and I continued in the same way. The internal conflict inside me grew. I couldn't just ignore what was bothering me and retreat into the shadow of her needs as if I didn't exist. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but notice how much she was suffering and how much it was important to her that I spend more time with her than with my friends, work, or anything else. I still went out with friends, but each time I did, the process became more and more of a source of guilt. I began to feel like I had to justify my actions, as if every move I made was under scrutiny and every word I said could affect how my relationship was perceived. Thoughts about adapting to her so as not to disappoint her began to creep into my head. But there was a paradox here. The more I thought about what I should do for her, the less I felt like I was being truly honest with myself. Sometimes I felt like I was a prisoner of circumstances, trying to please. I tried to find compromises, but each time they didn't seem so fair. Even when I canceled meetings with friends or cut back on the time I spent with myself, I didn't feel like I had found a balance. However, the girl's face didn't show the joy I had hoped to see, and I doubted that she herself realized how strong my internal conflict was. One evening after I returned home from yet another meeting, I felt that this could not go on any longer. I sat there wondering how to explain all my feelings without hurting her, without blaming her, without questioning our connection. I knew that our relationship could not be built only on sacrifices, even if I tried to justify it to myself. Something had to change. I knew that our silence was not a solution. It was only making the problem worse. I could no longer hide my feelings from her, and I needed to not only tell her how I felt, but also tell her what I needed. I searched for words that could convey my position without creating a barrier between us. A few days later, after the weekend plans had become too much, I decided I needed to take charge of the conversation. I knew I could lose her if I didn't, and I guess that was the moment I felt like I was willing to fight for my feelings, no matter what. We couldn't be a successful couple if we didn't each feel like our needs were important. She shouldn't be the one making decisions for both of us. When we sat down to eat, I immediately told her that I wanted to talk about what had happened over the past few weeks. I started by acknowledging how much I valued her and how much she meant to me. This was important because, at some point, I began to doubt whether she took my feelings seriously, and I wanted her to understand how deeply I cared. I explained that despite my best efforts to be there for her and support her, it was important for me to have space for my own interests. I told her that hanging out with friends wasn't just a way for me to pass the time, but a way to be myself, to de-stress, and to recharge. And while I was willing to give her attention and care, I couldn't be her exclusive source of support if I felt like I lacked balance in my life. I felt like she was listening to me carefully. And although her face was tense, at some point I noticed her relax a little. I realized that she wasn't judging me for my feelings, but perhaps she didn't fully understand them. I needed to not only explain what I was going through, but also make sure she understood that this wasn't a rejection of her needs, but rather a request for reciprocity and respect for mine. When I finished, the room was silent. I waited for her reaction, unsure how she would take my words. Her eyes never left mine, but she didn't say anything right away. I could sense how hard it was for her to accept my feelings, but I also knew that I needed to be honest and open, even if it meant jeopardizing our connection. Being honest with myself and with her was important. It had been a few days since I had revealed my feelings. In those days, I had been trying to understand what was going on inside her, what she was feeling, and how it would affect us. I knew it was important to give her time to process our conversations, but at the same time, it was hard not to push her, not to try to find out what she was thinking. The fear that everything would fall apart if she didn't understand me didn't let go. But I knew I couldn't act out of fear alone. It had to be honest. It had to be sincere. And then a few days later, she spoke again. This time, her words didn't sound accusatory or hurt, as before. It was like a soft sigh, as if after a long silence, she had finally found the words. I knew she was worried, but now I felt that she was beginning to accept my worries. We had both reached a point where we no longer wanted to simply hide our feelings, to play some kind of role. She started by apologizing. I didn't expect it, not because I didn't want her to, but because I always thought that talking about who was right and who was wrong wasn't the most important thing. However, her apology made me feel like she truly valued our relationship and what I was going through. She acknowledged that her words and demands were harsh and that she didn't realize how much they were affecting me. It was the first real, sincere acknowledgement that I had been missing. She also said that for her, my friends and my plans had become something that she perceived as a threat to our relationship, as something that took away the attention that she considered hers. And now that she understood that I needed my time with them, my space, she realized that this did not mean that she was not important to me. This was difficult for her to accept, but she said it with sincerity. I listened carefully, trying to understand what was behind each word. Her words did not sound like excuses, but rather like an attempt to understand how she could change herself and her expectations. I felt relieved that she was willing to open up and not just be defensive. This was the moment when I realized that we had to work on our relationship to create not just a successful couple, but truly close people who understand and support each other despite our differences. We discussed how to better handle situations where our needs might clash. I admitted that it was important to me not just to spend time with my friends, but also to not feel guilty about it. I also said that I didn't want my friends to be the cause of conflict. It was important to me that she understand that I still love her and that hanging out with friends doesn't mean I put them above her. When she agreed that we could find some kind of balance that would be comfortable for both of us, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my heart. We hadn't found the perfect solution right away, and I understood that the process of working on yourself and the relationship takes time. But already at that moment, I felt that we weren't on different sides, as we had been before. We started speaking the same language, and that gave me hope that we could move forward despite all the difficulties. Then I suggested that if she wanted, I could reschedule one of my friend's dates to spend time with her. It wasn't because I was afraid of losing her, but because I wanted to show that I was willing to compromise if she was willing to understand. She thought for a moment and said that she didn't want me to cancel my friend's dates. Instead, we decided that we would plan time together without creating pressure. I felt like we were slowly finding a balance that would allow us to grow together, rather than against each other. We hadn't eliminated the tension entirely, but we had found a way to live with it, to work with it, and that was an important step in our relationship. I didn't expect the solution to be immediate, but I knew that we would have to have more conversations, more open and honest discussions where we could express our feelings and needs without hiding behind silence or misunderstandings. Eventually, I realized that our relationship wouldn't be perfect, and that's okay. But when we talk openly about what's bothering us, when we're willing to listen to each other, it makes us stronger. This process continued, but I was no longer afraid that we wouldn't be able to overcome obstacles. With each step, I felt how we became closer, and I realized that this was perhaps the most important part of our relationship. As each day went by, as we continued to work on our relationship, I began to realize that much had changed. This process, despite the difficulties and pain, allowed us to see each other in a new light. We were no longer just two people spending time together without thinking about the depth of what was happening between them. We became partners who taught each other, listened to each other, discovered and rebuilt our inner worlds. It was not easy, but I began to feel that we both became stronger. Our conversations have become deeper, more frank. I am not afraid to talk about my feelings, my fears and desires. Previously, I was afraid that expressing these emotions could lead to conflict, to even greater alienation. But now I understand that this is what sincerity and openness helps us to be not just partners, but also people who support each other in moments of weakness. We understood that we can be different, and this does not make us worse for each other. On the contrary, it gives us the opportunity to learn and grow. Once we aligned our schedules and I was more flexible with our plans, we started spending more time together. It wasn't just hanging out. We started paying attention to what was important to each of us, despite all the external circumstances. At times, I thought we wouldn't have special time for other people anymore, but we were able to find that balance. I realized that maybe we needed to go through all this to understand how important it is to value the time we spend together and learn to share that time. The times when she demanded more attention became an opportunity for me to understand that in a relationship, you need to not just survive, but also take care of your partner, be attentive to their needs. I began to see that sometimes, despite all the circumstances, it is important to just be there, even if everything seems difficult. And in turn, she began to better understand that I also need my space, not only to maintain connections with friends, but also to maintain my personal harmony. We learned to respect each other's boundaries. We started traveling more together, going on weekends, vacations. It became a time when we could really open up, just be with each other, without pressure, without having to justify ourselves. We started talking often about what was important to us, what our personal goals were, what we wanted to achieve in life and in our relationship. This process of self-discovery and mutual knowledge became another step towards strengthening our bonds. But the most important thing I have learned over all this time is that there is no such thing as a perfect relationship. No one can promise that everything will be smooth, that there will be no difficult moments. We learn not from each other's mistakes, but from our own. We learned to say I instead of you, and this became the basis for moving forward. We began to understand that despite all the disagreements, our love and willingness to work on ourselves is what makes us stronger. Looking back, I would say that those months were the most difficult, but also the most important in our lives. Those were the moments when we overcame not only external obstacles, but also our own internal barriers. And despite all the difficulties, I realized that I do not complain about what happened. We went through a lot, but now, when I look at our lives, I feel that we have become not just a couple, but partners, ready to support each other in any situation. We started talking about the future, about how we could build a life together. It wasn't just planning. It was the realization that each of us, despite all our personal struggles, was ready to move forward on this journey together. We became not only each other's support, but also a source of inspiration. And although we are still learning, every day reminds me that true success in a relationship is not about avoiding conflict, but about learning to overcome it together with respect and love. Our meetings with friends became easier, our conversations more honest. We began to trust each other more and expect less that one of us would always be right. Instead, we learned to be there for each other, despite all the difficulties, understanding that ultimately love and partnership are not competition, but support and mutual understanding. This was our path, and I was ready to continue it with her. In the end, what seemed like a breakup was the beginning of something new. I felt our relationship was getting stronger, and although there were still many challenges ahead, I was sure that we could get through them together. We learned to look to the future, and for me, that was the most important achievement. Story 2. I never thought I would be in this situation. My lease ends in 3 months, and I finally have a chance to escape. This town is too small for me. Everyone knows everyone here, and whenever something bad happens, everyone talks about it for a week and then forgets. People disappear, and after a few nights of vigil and posters asking for help, everyone just goes on with their lives, as if nothing happened. I don't want to stay here. I always thought I would leave as soon as I saved up the money, moving to another state, a new life, but right now all I care about is money. I work nights at a coffee shop where I close my shift. It was a temporary solution to get money faster. I've been closing the store for 14 nights in a row now. I know it's not the healthiest decision, but I always convince myself that it's worth sacrificing a little comfort for the money. Every night after the last customers leave, I start cleaning. Cleaning the coffee machine, wiping down the counters, restocking the pastries. Locking the doors at 10, cleaning until 11:30, and usually leaving by midnight. It was all pretty monotonous, until I noticed something odd. It was 5 days after I started working nights. At first I didn't pay attention, but then I started noticing a strange knocking noise coming from the back door, the one that leads to the empty alley. Not the customer door, but the back one, the one used for trash and inventory. I'd gotten used to the quiet of this part of town, the emptiness of the night when everyone was asleep. At first the knocks were soft and non-aggressive, just persistent. Knock, knock, pause, knock, knock, knock. They didn't stop. I thought it might be one of the local homeless. We have a few of those here, wandering around this area, sometimes asking for food or money. Sometimes I'd leave them a couple of muffins or a cup of warm coffee, but when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door anyway, hoping to help some of these people. Maybe someone was lost or in need, but there was nothing. Just the usual stack of empty milk crates that were left behind after deliveries, and the awful smell of old coffee grounds that always lingered in the alley. No wind, no cars, just silence. I shrugged. Maybe I was imagining it. I've always had a vivid imagination, and being tired wasn't helping me think clearly. I tend to get a little nervous at night, but I think it's just my head playing tricks on me. Everything will be fine. But the next day, it happened again, and the next. Every night, every time, the same knocks. Weak at first, then louder. At first they seemed soft, then like someone was scratching the door from the inside. Knock, 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 scratching. I even started locking the back door with multiple locks and dimming the lights in the store so as not to attract attention. I thought that would help, but none of these solutions worked. They kept coming. I tried to ignore it, turned up the music to drown it out. Sometimes I'd turn on something soft to calm down, sometimes loud music to distract myself. But nothing helped. The sounds wouldn't stop. I was starting to feel my head pounding with anxiety. Something was wrong. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my blood, a strange feeling that came with every knock in the night. One night, about 10 days later, as I was finishing cleaning out the back room, I found a crumpled receipt lying under the door. I leaned over to pick it up. On the receipt was written strangely in black marker, "I like your skin." I froze. It was like a blow to the head. My hands began to shake. My first instinct was to call my manager. I did, but he was unable to offer anything useful. He advised me to call the police. I followed his advice, although I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't know what it meant. Was it a joke, or was someone really trying to scare me? I felt weird, almost like I was in a horror movie. But of course, the police came, looked around the alley, shook their heads and said it was probably just someone's stupid joke. They advised me not to be alone at night anymore, and maybe avoid working during those hours. Very helpful. The next day I thought I needed to do something. Maybe I was being a bit dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a box cutter to work and hid it in my apron pocket. It sounded silly, but I needed to do something to feel safe. I kept working and thought that maybe this would end. But by nightfall the next day, the strange events continued. Expectations were not met. On the second day, I decided not to open the back door. I even checked it several times, making sure the lock was definitely closed and the chain was tight. Still, the feeling of unease did not leave me. I continued to work, but now with the constant feeling that someone was watching me. I rarely looked up from my work, and even when I turned off the light in the utility room, it seemed to me that someone was standing in the corner, in the darkness. The night was especially silent, and even the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnecessary. I turned off the music player, trying to listen for those ill-fated knocks, but the silence was deafening. I didn't know what to feel. If this was a joke, then someone was spending too much time on it. And if it wasn't a joke, I was becoming increasingly uneasy. It only got worse. After a couple of nights, the knocks became louder. Now they were clearly audible not only at the back door, but throughout the entire alley, as if someone was crunching stones or knocking on the walls. At one point, I even thought that someone was trying to scratch something on the door from the outside. These weren't just sounds. These were bangs, as if someone was trying to get in. One day after another knock, I couldn't resist. I opened the back door and quickly looked out into the alley. But this time, when I looked out, I saw nothing. Only an empty alley disappearing into the shadows of the buildings. At that moment, I felt something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. I decided to call the police again. However, that was not enough. The inner unease did not subside, despite their words. "We have already checked this place." I was on the verge of leaving this place and never coming back. This whole feeling of abnormality just wouldn't leave me. And then, one night, when I was about to go home, I heard her. The voice, Anna, that same one, barely audible, as if from the very heart of darkness. My hands froze on the door handle, and my legs didn't move, as if they were frozen in ice. There was a buzzing inside my head, a whisper, a grinding sound, and some strange phrase. I couldn't make it out exactly, but it sounded familiar. Something like, "You won't run away." I took a step back, thinking with horror about what could be behind the door. I jerked the door open, glancing down the dark alley. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. Ahead of me stood a figure, barely discernible in the dim light, its outline barely visible. I couldn't make out its face, but I had the distinct feeling that it was looking right at me. That look, it pierced me. It was more than just a person. It was something from another reality. My legs buckled and I quickly closed the door, locking it with all the locks. A shiver like a horde of ants spread through my body. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't stay here another minute. My eyes were wide open and my heart was pounding. I didn't know who this figure was, but I felt that it wanted something. I opened my phone and dialed my manager. He answered with obvious reluctance. "What happened?" he asked, a little annoyed. I poured out everything I felt on him, but he, like last time, only told me that I needed to calm down and wait it out. But how can you calm down when you feel like there's something hidden behind these walls? I realized that I couldn't handle it myself and finally made a decision. I was leaving. I handed in my resignation and packed my things. The local authorities didn't take me seriously, and I couldn't leave it all without consequences. As soon as I got the last of my things, I called the manager and said that I wasn't coming back. When I left that place, I felt relief. It was a strange feeling, not joy, but more like escaping a nightmare. I didn't know where to go. I just ran out into the street, into the night air. Maybe I went somewhere else, or maybe I decided to just disappear. I don't remember how I ended up at the bus stop, but when the bus came, I got on and left. But all the way, I felt like this night wouldn't let me go. I drove, but I was haunted by the same feelings I had in the coffee shop. Something was following me, something that was watching from the shadows. When I arrived in a new city, I thought that maybe all the weirdness would be left in the past. But the more time I spent here, the more I felt like I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible was following me. At first, I tried to lead a normal life. Work, meet people, go shopping. But deep down, I knew that this shadow that was following me was still there. A few days passed, and I had to get a new job in a small library on the outskirts of the city. It was a calming place, full of the smell of old books and the quiet rustle of pages. I thought that maybe working in such an atmosphere would help me get rid of the anxiety that was constantly gnawing at me. But the more I was there, the stranger things became. I noticed it right away. The books in the library, especially the old and dusty ones, started to change their places. Every time I came in the morning, 1 or 2 volumes were no longer where I had left them. It happened gradually, and I thought it was my fault. Perhaps I had accidentally moved the books. But with each passing day, the mistake became more and more obvious. More and more books disappeared or were moved to shelves where they should not have been. When I asked my colleagues, they just shrugged their shoulders as if nothing had happened. But the strangeness didn't stop. At some point, I began to notice that, despite my leaving in the evening, someone was still working in the library. Sometimes I would come in the morning and find printouts of some materials I didn't know about lying on the table. And this wasn't a coincidence. These papers were designed as if for real research, but I couldn't remember anyone asking me about them. I felt increasingly alone and alienated in this place. A couple of times I tried to stay in the library after closing time to see who it could be, but every time I stayed overnight, I found nothing. However, I would still hear the quiet sounds of footsteps in the hallway, the faint rustling of paper, or an ominous crunch, as if someone was stepping over invisible obstacles. I would react to these sounds with horror, but I would always find myself completely alone. One evening, I stayed late in the library, deciding that this time I would figure out what was going on. I turned off the light and listened to every rustle. Some time passed, and I began to think that it was all a figment of my imagination. However, at some point, when I was almost asleep at the table, I heard them. The same knocking I had heard in the coffee shop, but now it was louder and more distinct. It was not coming from the wall, but from the book itself, which I was holding in my hands. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up abruptly and turned the book over. There was nothing on the pages, just ordinary words. But when I put it back, I noticed that there was another book on the shelf that I definitely hadn't put there. It was an old book with a worn cover, its pages almost black with age. I opened it, and my gaze immediately fell on the strange writing at the very beginning. "Don't run from it. You'll come back anyway." The text was written sloppily, as if in a sloppy handwriting. My fingers froze on the pages, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to figure out what it could mean. Maybe it was a joke, but it all seemed too real. All these books, movements, sounds, they seemed to be deliberately pulling me towards themselves, forcing me to return to where I was trying to escape from. I put the book back on the shelf, quickly closed it, and hurried out of the library. But when I stepped outside, the sky above grew dark and restless. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt everything around me begin to change. I was part of something bigger than I could imagine. Maybe it wasn't just books. Maybe it was some kind of vicious cycle I was caught in, and I couldn't escape. Returning to normal life no longer seemed possible. My world seemed to be falling apart, and every morning I woke up with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Every night I heard these sounds: rustling, footsteps, whispers. It seems that I am constantly forgetting something, but I can't figure out what. The feeling that someone is looking for me does not leave me. And the worst thing is that I am afraid that one day they will find me. Every day I sank deeper into this strange, unclear reality, where everything around me seemed to lose its meaning. It became unbearable for me to stay in the city, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I was part of something huge and inevitable. Sometimes I tried to find logic in what was happening, but the answers always seemed too distant and confusing. I tried to think that it was just my paranoia, that I was simply tired, but every new event convinced me otherwise. A few days later, I noticed another book had appeared on an old library bookshelf. It was completely different from all the others. The large black letters on the cover were strangely distorted, and when I opened it, I knew at first glance that this was not a book, this was something else. On the first page it said, "You are not alone, and you will not leave." My heart started beating faster. It was like a warning. I knew I shouldn't read on, but something was pulling me. With each page, the text became stranger and more confusing. It wasn't just words, it was a record, a description of my actions, the places I'd been, the people I'd interacted with. At first, I thought it was just coincidences, but then I realized it was written in the present tense. I read, and every line felt like a part of my recent experience. Even more, it described things that were yet to happen, things I hadn't told anyone about yet. I put the book back on the shelf, almost in a panic. What did this mean? Who could write about me in such detail so precisely? I decided to talk to my colleagues, but they just shrugged their shoulders, as always, and didn't pay much attention to me. Their reaction was almost as if they already knew what I was going through, but just didn't want to talk about it. One evening, after a long day at work, I felt a strange tension in the air. I didn't know what exactly was bothering me so much, but this time it was something different. For some unknown reason, I decided to stay late into the evening to try to figure out what was going on. I didn't believe in paranormal phenomena, but at that moment it seemed like all of reality was somehow distorted. Finding myself in an empty building, I felt like every shadow on the walls seemed to be moving, as if it was alive. As the clock began to strike midnight, I heard a familiar sound, footsteps. But this time they weren't just echoing in the hallway, they were real, coming closer. And I couldn't ignore them. I stood up, listening, watching every movement. At first I thought it was a colleague of mine, someone who had worked before me, but when I turned around, no one was standing at the door. I felt a shudder run through my body. The footsteps continued, but they were closer now. I walked towards the exit, thinking it was someone lost, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but strange. I heard the rustling again, and this time it came not from the depths of the building, but from the library itself. I walked into the office and saw one of the books shift, as if someone had passed by. It was the same book with the black letters on the cover. It was lying on the floor, and the pages seemed to be moving on their own. I walked up to it and noticed with horror that the words on the pages began to change. At first, these were imperceptible changes, but the longer I looked, the more obvious they became. As if the book was adapting to my thoughts, inscribing my experiences, my fears, my feelings. I recoiled. It was impossible. My heart started beating wildly again, and I ran for the exit. But at that moment, I heard another sound, not footsteps, but a voice. It was quiet, muffled, but clearly audible, as if someone was whispering right in my ear. "You can't run away." I froze. The words were in my head, but not coming from my head. It wasn't just a voice. It was something that had entered my consciousness, that had become a part of me. I forced myself to turn around, but instead of coming out, I saw myself. It was me, but not the me I knew. It wasn't my face that was reflected in the mirror, but a face alien to me, covered in the same empty expression I'd once seen in that very book. The smile was wrong, like everything else. "You can't run away," the voice repeated, and now I realized that it came from this existence that had become a part of me. It was my own reflection, but it was alive. And I knew that if I didn't run away right now, if I couldn't get rid of this horror, then everything I had ever known would be erased, like the pages of this book. I woke up late in the morning, feeling like every movement in my body was a struggle. My sleep had been restless, and when I opened my eyes, everything around me seemed slightly distorted, as if the world had been filmed on old film. My body felt unpacked, tired of something invisible. Something in the atmosphere seemed different than usual. That night when I saw that strange reflection in the mirror, it never left my consciousness. It was like a shadow, always one step behind. But now that I was awake, I felt like some part of me would never return to the world I knew. Something had changed, but I didn't know what. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get those words out of my head. "You can't run." I remembered the moment when I saw my own smile, a face that didn't belong to me. The feeling was unbearable. It kept clinging to me. But in my head, there was only one question. How can I get rid of it? And yet I knew that perhaps the answer was hidden in this library, but everything around me was already starting to fade. It seemed like I was caught in some kind of circle from which I could not escape. After I visited the library yet again, I felt as if its walls were breathing. The air was thick with something dark, invisible, and the longer I stayed there, the more I felt as if the place was trying to swallow me whole. All those books that I had so carefully arranged on the shelves were now out of order, as if they had been placed by hands that could not belong to living beings. They were old, covered in dust, but I could not shake the thought that their pages could be much more alive than I had imagined. With each passing minute, I became more and more afraid. I tried to work as usual, but I couldn't concentrate. Everything that was happening around me seemed to change its order. The sounds of footsteps began to haunt me again. Now they were not just sounds. I could hear breathing that did not belong to me, and this breathing sounded closer, louder. It did not come from a living person. It was like something old, like something that had been left in these walls long ago, waiting for someone to disturb their peace again. When I opened one of the books, which was particularly strange, the pages were not just written. They seemed to reflect some kind of experience. On the first pages, there were only words, and each word sounded louder, as if it was coming straight from my own mind. I read these lines, and each word penetrated me more deeply. I felt my heart pound and the blood boil in my veins as I realized that this book was describing what was happening to me. These weren't just words. It was like a manual for those trapped like me. I read it out loud, even though I knew I shouldn't. As I read, the words on the pages began to change. But not just change, they spread. They became long, twisted into strange shapes. It was like a strange vision. You can't leave. They won't let you go. With each line, those words became more and more obvious. They weren't just a warning. They were like the beginning of the worst nightmare I had ever been drawn into. When I looked up, something had changed in the room. The library walls seemed much darker now, and the air was thick and heavy. I looked around but saw only books and emptiness. And at that moment it became clear to me I was not alone. Behind me on the shelf stood another book, the same one with black letters. And on its pages again appeared the words that I could not ignore. You are not here by chance, and you are not alone. The cold I felt in that moment was unlike any fear I had ever felt before. I backed away from the shelf, but felt like my legs couldn't move. Suddenly, the walls of the library began to close in, and I realized that they were closing in on me. This wasn't just an illusion. I couldn't move. I couldn't get out. Every breath I took became heavy. Every glance at the books that stood before me filled me with unbearable horror. Everything around me began to turn into a nightmare. I felt invisible hands squeezing me. It was a terrible feeling of helplessness. I tried to scream, but my voice did not come out, as if the space around me was swallowing everything. It was as if I was a part of the book, and this book was not going to let me go. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally managed to take a step, but every step felt like a heavy weight. I tried to leave the library, but the door, like everything around me, seemed sealed, unyielding to my efforts. Everything around me was distorted, as if I was inside some other world, where every movement was slow and my breath seemed like it was my last. I realized that this place was not just a library. This was not just a house for books. It was something much more dangerous, and I knew that now I would not be able to leave it. Every step, every movement pulled me further into this labyrinth, where nothing was real. Everything around me was alive, but not in the way I was used to. And I understood I was only a part of this horror. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that the world around me was no longer the same. The air was thick, oppressive, and all sounds seemed strangely muffled. It was as if I had found myself in another reality, where familiar things no longer mattered. The library that I loved so much now seemed like a prison. It wrapped itself around me with invisible threads, each day more tightly, pulling me further into its strange world. This time I came to it determined to understand. My nights were becoming more and more tormented. Each dream seemed like some kind of twisted nightmare, where I was running but could not get out. I could no longer remain passive. I had to find out what was hidden behind these walls. When I entered the library, I realized that everything had changed again. The shelves were not as I remembered, and the books were shifted, as if someone had leafed through them and looked at them again, but had not touched them with their hands. There were not only books on the shelves, but also strange objects. Pieces of paper, what looked like old newspapers, strange black stones. None of it made sense, but I knew it was no accident. I walked up to the book that had started it all. It was still in its place, and although its cover was still black, its appearance had become different. It was now covered in a thin layer of dust that seemed too alive. I carefully opened it, And at that moment, I was overcome with fear, so strong that I could not move from the spot. The text on the pages began to change shape again. They weren't ordinary words. They were spreading, stretching, and twisting, creating symbols I couldn't understand. I couldn't tear myself away from the sight. With each new look, the text became more familiar. It was telling me things I couldn't explain. My own thoughts were written on these pages. I saw them adapting to my fears, my experiences. My memories and desires were rewritten, and now they were becoming part of something that defied human understanding. "You are not here by chance," I read on one of the pages. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart began to beat faster again. These words no longer seemed like just text to me. It was something alive, something that was trying to manipulate me, to impose its will. I tried to close the book, but it was as if it was glued to my hands. I could not tear myself away from it. I knew that if I did not leave now, if I could not get out of this damn place, I would stay here forever. I tried to get up, but at that moment I felt the walls of the library begin to close in. The air became even heavier, and I felt all my strength disappear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Everything in my head was spinning, like in some terrible dream. I didn't know how long I stood in this state, trying to escape from this hell. Then just when I was about to give up, I felt something touch my hand. It wasn't a human touch. It was cold, smooth, yet powerful. I turned around but saw nothing, only emptiness. The emptiness that inhabited the library. It was then that I realized that this library wasn't just sinister, it was alive. It was part of something older than I could have imagined. This place was the source of something that was causing all these strange events. I wasn't just its prisoner, I was part of its history, its curse. When I tried to get out again, the door that had previously opened effortlessly was now closed. I pushed at it, but it wouldn't budge. I knew then that there was no way out. I was part of this nightmare, and it would continue until I found a way to free myself. Every step, every movement seemed slower now, as if I was in some other dimension. I felt my strength fading. My eyes were heavy. My thoughts were confused. At that moment, I realized that everything that was happening to me was not just a coincidence. It was a whole process. I was part of something bigger, and if I didn't find a way to get out, this place would swallow me whole. Suddenly, something was pulling me back. I tried to take a step, but I was paralyzed. An unknown being or force was taking me deeper into this library. I realized that I had become a part of it, and now I couldn't escape. Every time I tried to return home, I felt my body being pulled to another place. The library, which had once been a place of peace and solitude for me, now became more and more like a trap. My thoughts became entangled as if in a web, and every step in its corridors seemed more and more unnatural. I was no longer sure where reality began and where this place ended. That day, I decided to spend more time there. I knew that if I didn't find out what was going on, I wouldn't be able to live in peace any longer. When I walked in, everything seemed different, as if the library had been waiting for me. The shelves that had been neatly arranged before now seemed to have been moved around haphazardly, as if someone had walked through them with difficulty, without caring about the order. I started looking for books that could give me an answer to everything that was happening. Everything I had read so far made no sense. The pages of the books had no logic. The text shifted, disappeared, and new ones appeared. It was strange, but not in the same way as in the old horror stories I read as a child. It was a much deeper and more disturbing feeling, as if the world itself was beginning to disappear around me. As I was wandering through this strange library, I heard a sound. It was barely audible, but I could feel it, like something was scraping the walls. I stopped and looked around. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it inside me. As if it wasn't just noise, it was something much more sinister. My heart started beating faster, and I knew something was wrong. I decided to go to that shelf that always attracted me, where the very books that had caught my attention since the first day stood. This shelf was covered in fog. This fog wasn't ordinary. It felt like something alive. It was wrapping itself around me, making me feel like I was losing touch with reality. I couldn't think clearly, but I had to get there. When I picked up one of the books from the shelf, I felt it suddenly become heavy. I could barely hold it in my hands. The texts on the pages began to creep from one place to another, as if they had a life of their own. It was as if the words were trying to leave the pages and return to the space that had created them. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer simply observe. All of this was part of not just the book, but the library itself. It was absorbing me, my thoughts, my feelings. I was unable to separate reality from what was happening around me. There was no way out. I tried to find the door, tried to go back, but everything had changed. The floors, the ceilings, the shelves, all of this began to tightly squeeze the space I found myself in. It seemed that the library was simply growing around me, squeezing me within its walls. And then I realized that these books weren't just storing knowledge. They were part of this place. They had a life of their own, changing reality, as if they were guides to another world. This world was ancient and sinister, and I had become part of it. I tried desperately to get out, but every step I took only led me into new, even more confusing corridors. In these corridors, I couldn't find a way out. I couldn't find shelter. Everything around me became blurry, like in a nightmare in which you can't escape, no matter how hard you try. My head felt heavy, my thoughts were jumbled, and I began to lose track of time. I didn't know how many hours had passed since I'd entered that library, or even how many days. Everything seemed the same, but at the same time, everything was changing. I felt the space around me shrinking, the library swallowing me whole, and suddenly it became clear to me that I was a part of it in the most literal sense. I felt something pulling me along, like an invisible hand. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something more. And in that moment, I realized the library wasn't just absorbing me, it was trying to make me a part of it. Story 3. I don't remember when I first noticed him. He was just a part of the world around me, unnoticeable, like the shadow you feel on the back of your neck but can't always see. But something about his presence made me uneasy. Why was he watching me? Why did I always feel that gaze like a cold wind that wouldn't let me go? No matter where I went, it was a feeling that permeated my every thought, haunting me. I started noticing him in the strangest places, sometimes in the library, where I was looking through old books, sometimes at the bus stop, waiting for the bus. He was there, always on the edge of my vision, but never close enough for me to see his face clearly. I knew he couldn't see me, at least not at that moment, but I could still feel his gaze. It was as if my every move was under close observation. I can't say I believed in paranoia. No, I was a rational person, with my feet firmly on the ground. But there are things that haunt you, even if you try to ignore them. It was like a fog in my mind that grew thicker with each passing day. I began to worry when his appearances became too frequent. His figure became more and more distinct, and I felt my steps on the way home becoming more and more anxious. He could be no one and nothing, but I felt that there was something more behind him, as if I was part of a game in which I did not know the rules. One weekend, I decided to take a walk through an old park to clear my head. I hoped that the fresh air would help me sort out my thoughts. Far from the bustle of the city, under the gray clouds, the park seemed abandoned, like an old house forgotten by time. I walked slowly along the path, feeling the sand under my nails and the smell of damp earth in the air. Suddenly I felt it, that same look that I couldn't get out of my head. This time it was closer, so close that I could feel its presence, like a tightness in my chest. I looked around, but saw no one. It was quiet, too quiet, as if time had stopped. But the feeling that he was there did not leave me. I quickened my pace and my eyes darted along the empty path. Far ahead, at the end of the alley, I saw his silhouette, standing by a tree, barely visible in the twilight. He did not move. He just stood there, as if he were part of this world, and yet I knew that he was as alien to this place as I was. As I came closer, his figure disappeared. I peered into the dark corners and dense foliage, but he was gone. The feeling that he was there remained, but it did not give me peace, but only added tension. I decided that this was enough and turned to leave. But as soon as I began to move, I felt that gaze again. It did not disappear. I quickened my pace as if I wanted to escape from my own thoughts, but my steps became heavy, and it seemed that the air around me had compressed. He was near in my every move. I didn't know what to do. Panic was growing in my chest, but I knew I needed to calm down somehow return to reality. As I reached the exit of the park, I thought I felt his gaze again. I paused for a moment, looking around, and then I realized I wasn't alone. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. He was with me even though I was in my own home, in my own space, which I always considered safe. I went to my desk, turned on the light, but even then something was wrong. I had no peace, and I increasingly felt like this strange person, or perhaps not a person, was watching my every move. In the evening, I decided to check my mail, but I found that in the last few days I had been receiving strange messages. They did not contain any words, only coded signs that did not seem to make sense. I read them over and over again, trying to find some logic, but I could not. This only added to the anxiety. Every day, every minute became more like a game in which I was a pawn, and I did not know who was pulling the strings. I had no choice but to believe that this something was just a figment of my imagination. But more and more often I doubted it, because this feeling was too real, too present. It wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, in my skin, in my heart, and I didn't know what to do with this knowledge. The next morning, I decided not to think about him. The strange man, the mysterious messages. It could have been a coincidence, the result of fatigue or stress. I tried to convince myself that none of it mattered. However, the more I tried to forget, the more these thoughts haunted me. They haunted me like loud footsteps in an empty room that I couldn't ignore. I was about to go outside, but something caught my attention. On the door, right in my entryway, I noticed a new piece of paper. It was slightly wrinkled, as if someone had just left it there without paying attention to neatness. It was strange. I couldn't remember receiving anything or seeing any of the neighbors recently. I felt uneasy, but I walked closer and unfolded the paper. There were only a few words written in pen on it. You are not alone. The message was simple enough not to cause panic, but too specific to be ignored. I immediately felt the blood drain from my face. This was what I was thinking, what I was feeling. He was watching me, and now I knew for sure. I wasn't just the object of casual attention. This was personal. I couldn't help but think about what had happened in the park yesterday. I saw that silhouette again, only now it seemed much more serious. It wasn't just a coincidence. This man knew something about me. He probably knew more than I did. Almost instinctively, I decided not to tell my neighbors or friends about the leaflet. It would seem trivial, odd, and unlikely to be taken seriously. What if it was just some stranger who didn't know the boundaries of personal space? Or was it just someone's unfortunate sense of humor that I couldn't understand? No, there was more to it. My fear and anxiety were all too real. I felt trapped, as if this was a step in a long game from which there was no escape. When I looked back, it seemed as if I had suddenly found myself at a dead end. All the roads ahead, both in life and in my thoughts, were blocked by this man, this stranger who might not just be someone from my circle. I knew that the more I tried to explain what was happening to myself, the less I understood. That evening, I decided to do something normal. I needed to break out of this tense cycle and try to regain at least the illusion of calm. I turned on the TV to distract myself, although in reality I could hardly concentrate on anything other than thoughts about what was happening. But even as I tried to follow some movie, the thought kept spinning in my head that maybe he was no longer in this city. Maybe I was exaggerating, and he wasn't that threatening. Maybe he was just an ordinary person with nothing better to do. But just as I realized that I was giving into calm, there was a sound, a light scraping, as if someone was slowly running a finger across the glass. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the window. Everything was the same as before, except that the night light was reflecting off the wet glass, adding an ominous coloring to the picture. At first, I didn't want to check, but something made me get up and go to the window. Slowly, reluctantly, I pulled back the curtains and peered out into the night. The fog was creeping down the street, and the dark silhouettes of the trees seemed eerie and alien. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I felt it again, that gaze. It was in the corner where I knew no one should be. But this time was different. He was closer. I could clearly see the silhouette of a man standing by the dark alley. He didn't move, didn't take a single step. He just stood there like a stone statue, swallowed by the night. I couldn't believe my eyes. He knew I'd seen him. And now I knew he'd been waiting. I didn't know what to do. Panic filled my chest, and I felt the air getting heavier. I closed the window and backed away quickly, trying to control my breathing. But even with the windows and doors closed, I could feel his presence. This wasn't just a threat. This was a test. I was in his web, and now I had to find a way to break free. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept racing, trying to find an explanation, trying to understand what had happened. But the more I tried to understand, the less I could. He was there, and I didn't know how long I could avoid what was destined for me. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. Sleep hadn't brought relief. On the contrary, it had left me even more tired. It seemed that the night had turned into something more than just insomnia. Every movement, every glance into the dark corners of the room was full of doubt, as if I was still being watched even when the light filled my space. I tried to push these thoughts away and start the day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My house was silent. The silence that had once been calming now caused anxiety. It seemed that I already knew that I would never be able to live in this place peacefully again. I looked at my door again, seeing nothing new. The piece of paper I had found yesterday was still there, but it didn't seem so strange now. It was part of something bigger, hidden from my understanding. My desire to ignore it faded, and I felt a cold sense of wariness creeping through me. I couldn't stay like this. I knew I had to act. I decided to go outside, hoping that the fresh air would clear my head a little. As soon as I left the apartment, I was hit by a cold wind that picked up autumn leaves and dragged them along the street. It was strangely calming, as if nature itself was trying to remind me that the world had not stopped, that there was life beyond my experiences. But as I walked along the sidewalk, every step seemed like a distant echo, reminding me that I was not alone. Every movement in the shadows, every noise from the alleys made me turn around, checking if someone was watching me. The inner feeling of anxiety was growing stronger. And then, on one of the streets, I saw him again. He stood in the shadow of the building, motionless, like last time. This time I couldn't afford to pretend that nothing was happening. It was too obvious to ignore. He was looking straight at me, and I felt a chill run through me to the bone. It seemed he was the same man who had left those mysterious notes. I couldn't be sure, but something told me that this was no coincidence. I stood there transfixed by his gaze. He stood there, unmoving, and I noticed how he suddenly tilted his head slightly, as if assessing me. I tried not to show my alarm, but I felt my fingers curling into fists. This was not what I expected. I thought this would end differently. I thought maybe I was wrong, that I was just a victim of my own fantasy. But his gaze was too real, and his silence was too loud. Not knowing what to do, I decided to continue on my way without turning around. But I felt his eyes following me. I quickened my pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still somewhere nearby, watching my every move. It was like on the edge of reason and madness. My thoughts were spinning, trying to find some explanation for what was happening, but nothing came to mind. When I returned home, the atmosphere in the apartment was just as heavy. I closed all the windows and doors, checked that there were no new notes, but I knew that this would not solve the problem. This man, his traces, his presence, were something real, something I could not ignore. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but all I could do was sit alone in a dark room, trapped in my own head. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted from me. But I knew one thing. It wouldn't end until I came face to face with him, but I was scared. His presence was becoming more and more tangible with each passing day. It was like the world around me was changing. I couldn't tell if it was real, but every instinct I had was screaming at me that there was no other version of events. I couldn't think of anything else. This man, his gaze, his silence, it was all too ominous to be a coincidence. I felt like I was being squeezed by this shadow, and maybe I was trapped with no way out. I woke up in the middle of the night, when the silence was especially thick, and the feeling of uncertainty that had been haunting me was now almost physical. Something in the air had changed, as if the room itself was tuned to a certain frequency that I couldn't place. I sat in the darkness, trying to process what was happening, like I was on the edge of something, unable or unprepared to see what was beyond that edge. There was no sound, no rustle, no movement, but I knew that someone was there. It wasn't just a feeling of fear, it was more than a feeling, it was a knowing. I couldn't explain why, but the sense of presence grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this person was closer than I thought. As if he was here, in this room, not physically, but his presence was absolutely real. I stood up and walked to the door, checking again if it was locked. It was strange behavior, as if I didn't trust myself. But when I turned the handle, it seemed as if something was moving behind the door, and I stopped, frozen. It wasn't just a sound, it was a footstep. The same footstep I heard last week. Strange, quiet, but distinct. The same sound that made me freeze. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't leave it as it was. I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and in the darkness I felt the air change. It was cold, as if something was standing in front of me, despite there being no visible source of the cold. I walked on, each step hesitant, each glance wary, and just like the moment I first felt this presence, I knew it was no coincidence. I stopped at the window, looking out at the night street. There was nothing in the light of the street lamp that could explain my worries. Everything was too calm, too quiet, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. I returned to my room, and this time, I did not try to convince myself that this was just a nightmare or paranoia. The next morning, I walked the same route as the day before, trying to keep these thoughts away. I couldn't tell myself that none of this was important because it was obvious to me that it was, but I didn't know how to explain these feelings. This man, his looks, his silence, all of it hung over me like an invisible shadow, and I couldn't escape it. He had become part of my world, part of something that couldn't go unnoticed. I knew I couldn't live in this constant anxiety, but something inside me told me that the solution wouldn't be that simple. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped, and that this trap was created by him. When I got home again, the silence came over me again, and I found myself alone in my apartment again, surrounded by this strange feeling. But now I knew that these were not just feelings. There was something more, and I needed to deal with it. I needed to find an answer. Despite the fear and uncertainty, I made a decision. If this man was still following me, I would watch him. I would search for an answer, no matter how scary it was. But I knew I couldn't continue to live in this anxiety. He had to understand that I wasn't going to be his victim. And when the moment came, I would be ready. That day started out like any other, but I knew something was different. I woke up with the feeling that everything around me had become tense. That same chill I had felt the night before was in the air again. It seemed to haunt me, lurking in the corners, filling my every step with anxiety. I took a quick shower trying to get rid of the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. I didn't know what it was, but that sense of presence wouldn't go away, and it was becoming clearer. There was a reason I felt like someone was watching me. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Everything around me seemed blurry, and my thoughts ran in one direction, to him. I always felt that he was somewhere nearby, but I couldn't figure out who he was. He remained a mystery to me, his shadow, an unknown trace that I could not find. I began to watch for his presence. It was almost instinctive. Every glance out the window, every rustle in the room, every step outside the door made me wary. I couldn't understand why he was watching me, but I knew I couldn't be just an object for him to observe. I had to understand his motives, understand why he was here. That evening, I decided that I would not leave this time. I would stay home, watch and wait for him to show himself again. It was time to finally face him. And although I knew it could be dangerous, I needed to know what was behind this presence. Night fell, and the silence upset me again. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, straining, listening to every sound. But nothing happened. Time dragged on slowly, as if everything around me had slowed down. The walls seemed to be shrinking, and the air was becoming thicker, heavier. I listened to every rustle, every movement, but there was nothing. My breathing became heavy, and I felt that coldness penetrating me again. I tried to calm myself down, but it was impossible. All my thoughts were in a tangle. I didn't know what to do. I had to find him. I had to understand who he was, why he was following me. I went back to my apartment, locked the doors, and opened the window. The night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness there was something dangerous, something watching me. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't continue living in this fear. I had to find an answer. I had to find it. At that moment, I decided that I would not stop. I would find him, even if it meant going through everything. My thoughts returned to his footsteps, to the feeling that he was always there, but still unreachable. Whoever he was, I felt that he was controlling me, manipulating me, not giving me a chance to escape from this strange trap. But I could not let him win. I would be in control of the situation. I would be the one to put an end to this story. But even with my determination, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only just beginning to understand how deeply I was caught up in this strange game. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I was sure that none of this was a coincidence. It was as if this man, or this creature, was playing with me, forcing me to experience fear and tension at every step. Then I took my first step, deciding that I would no longer follow his tracks. I would follow him, look for him, not expecting him to appear again. This nightmare could not last forever. I had to end it. When I woke up, the morning was as gray as my thoughts. I did not know why I continued to fight this feeling that someone was watching me. What was this force that did not let me go, not allowing me to forget about my anxiety and fear? But I could not live any longer, waiting for everything to go away on its own. I decided that today I would look for answers. He could not be just a figment of my imagination, no matter how much I wanted it to be. I got ready as usual and went outside, hoping that the fresh air would dispel my doubts. However, as soon as I stepped through the door, I was overcome by a strange feeling again. Everything around me was foggy, like in a nightmare, where shadows moved and seemed ominous. Even the sky seemed low, pressing down on me like a heavy roof about to collapse. I headed toward my car, and at that moment I thought I heard his footsteps again. It was a slight creaking, barely noticeable, but I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. I quickly looked around, but there was no one on the street. Everything was quiet. Everything was in place. And yet something was wrong. This feeling of being followed, this invisible presence, continued to loom like an approaching storm. I didn't know what to do next. My mind was racing, and I realized that I probably couldn't just walk away from this. The answers weren't going to come to me. I had to find them, no matter the consequences. I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to focus on the road. But even in this normal action, there was something wrong. It was like everything was in slow motion, as if the world around me was slightly distorted. I drove out of town, not knowing exactly where I was going. I just felt like I needed to move, to understand something. The car moved along familiar streets, but everything here seemed alien to me. Everything that had once been clear to me now seemed hidden, lurking darkness behind it. I drove on, not paying attention to turns and intersections, not knowing what I was looking for, but feeling that I had to find this place. This place that I had avoided for so long, this place where it all would begin. My path led me to a forgotten area I had never been to. It was empty, and the houses looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The place was so gloomy that even the sun seemed dim, unable to break through the thick clouds. I stopped the car and got out, feeling how every step I took echoed in this place. This was not a place I had ever been to. I walked along the abandoned street, and it seemed to me that with each step I took, the air became thicker and the shadows longer. I felt that someone was watching me, but I couldn't figure out who or where from. I kept walking, knowing that I was on the threshold of something important, that maybe this was the moment that would lead me to the solution. And so I found myself in front of an old building. It was collapsed, half abandoned, but still stood as if someone was watching it and someone was supporting its existence, not letting it disappear. The building looked at me with empty windows, like the eyes of a monster that does not sleep. I stood there hesitating, not knowing what to do, and then I heard the footsteps again. They weren't mine. They were coming from inside this building. At that moment, I realized that I hadn't come here by chance. I took a step toward the door, which was slightly open, and felt the cold penetrate me. It was dark and damp inside. The air here smelled of something ancient, something forgotten. I couldn't back out. My feet were leading me inside, even though my mind was screaming at me to stop. I was too close to turn back. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them clearly. There he was. He was here. I turned the corner and saw him. He was standing there in the darkness. Tall, his silhouette seemed unnaturally elongated, as if his body was not of this reality. His eyes glowed in the darkness like two fires, cold and soulless. I froze. I couldn't move. He looked at me, and his gaze was filled with something unimaginable, something inhuman. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something older. In that moment, I realized that I couldn't just get rid of this nightmare. I was connected to it, and now that I had met him, I would have to pay for everything. That moment seemed to last forever. I stood there unable to move, while his eyes never left mine. There was nothing human in them, only a coldness and emptiness that ate away at me from the inside. He was motionless, like a statue, but I felt his presence, as if he were part of the very darkness that surrounded us. I tried to understand who he was and why I was here, but my thoughts were in a fog. I didn't know how much time passed before I could finally take a step back, but as soon as I started walking, everything around me began to change. The building that seemed motionless suddenly began to sway, as if it were alive. With every step, my fear grew. I couldn't escape. I didn't know where to go. This place defied logic. I could go back, but I felt that if I did, I would remain here forever, in this forgotten place where there was no time or meaning. My legs carried me on without any control on my part, as if something invisible and powerful was holding me, guiding my steps in the right direction. I found myself in a corridor where the light flickered dimly, barely illuminating the path. The footsteps behind me did not stop. I heard them clearly, but I could not understand where they were coming from. Suddenly, a sound emerged from the darkness. Something creaked, like a door, or a window, or something else that I could not make out. Everything was mixed together in one mad stream. I turned the corner and immediately felt something cold touch my skin. It felt like an invisible hand had reached out from the shadows and touched me. I rushed forward, unable to stop myself, but each step I took seemed more and more useless. The walls around me began to change, their shapes and sizes smoothly distorting, as if the world itself was losing its shape, becoming something intangible and different. I didn't know how much time had passed, minutes or hours. Time seemed meaningless here. Suddenly, I felt someone grab my hand. It wasn't a real touch, but rather a feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around, but there was no one in front of me. Everything around was empty as before. But there was something that made me feel that I wasn't alone in this place, that something was watching me, observing. I couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling was so strong that I almost choked with fear. I continued walking forward until I found myself in a large hall. There was a huge table covered in dust, with nothing on it except old, yellowed papers and a few shabby candles that hadn't burned for a long time. Everything here was abandoned, but at the same time it seemed like someone was watching me from the dark corners of this hall. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of me. He was there. He, the one I had seen before. His eyes gleamed in the darkness like two coal fires. He was already too close, and I could not retreat. "You have come." His voice was like a whisper, but it penetrated right into my soul. It was not just a sound. It was a feeling, as if his words were pouring into my thoughts and changing there, making me doubt reality. I didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in my throat, and only anxiety and fear filled my chest. I stood before him, completely confused. "You were looking for answers," he continued, and I felt his words like icy arrows piercing me. "But you're not ready. You don't understand what you're looking for. You don't even realize what you found." Every word he said cut me like a knife. I felt the darkness around me thicken, like it was beginning to wrap its tentacles around me, as if it were trying to consume everything I'd ever known. I took another step back, and suddenly the world distorted again. Space began to distort, as if it were being swayed by some invisible force. The building began to collapse, and I felt that if I did not run away, this place would swallow me up, leaving me forever lost within its walls. I turned and ran, not paying attention to where or how. The main thing was to get away. But the faster I ran, the further away the exit became from me. I felt that the more I tried to escape, the more I was pulled back. I was losing strength. My legs became heavy as lead. And then I found myself again in the center of the hall, face to face with the one who had been with me all this time. He was standing there again, like a shadow biding his time. I could not leave. I could neither fight nor hide. Only him and me, in the emptiness that surrounded us. Story 4. They won't believe me. I know it. My friends, my family, they'll all laugh. They'll look at me with bewilderment, and if I keep talking, they'll probably just send me to a therapist to talk about what's wrong with me, and I can't blame them. It does sound crazy, but I can't stay silent. I have to do something because I can't continue living the way I did before. Maybe you think this is some kind of stupid joke, but when I tell you what's going on, maybe you'll understand. Although I'm not sure anyone will understand, except someone who's been through the same thing. I hoped that all this would pass. 2 months ago, everything was still normal. I was living my life as usual, going to the bar with friends on Fridays, having karaoke sessions, and doing everything I usually do on the weekends. It was just an evening at Mitch's, a small bar in the city center, the same bar where my friends and I met every week to laugh, drink beer, and sing a few songs. I remember that night. It was a Friday. Melly and I had just finished our version of Fleetwood's Rhiannon. Mac waddled happily back to our table when he came up. That guy, Tony, I never thought he'd leave a mark on my life. But he did. He said our first date was a classic. Dinner, a movie, a French restaurant. He was so romantic. He had everything planned out so well. I couldn't help but be impressed. I thought it was the beginning of something good, that I had a chance at a normal relationship. But then strange things started happening. And not right away, but gradually, as if someone was gently twisting a rope around my neck. And I didn't notice it right away. Tony, or Antonio, as he began to call himself, changed. At first it was little things. He said that he now only wanted to be Antonio, that he didn't like the name Tony because it sounded too frivolous. Somehow it didn't really alert me. I thought that maybe he was just having a moment of self-determination, and I didn't pay attention to it. We all change sometimes. But then a real series of changes began. He started to change his appearance. For the first time, I noticed that his hair was lighter, the same brown as mine. His eyes, which had been green before, were now a dark brown, like mine. He lost weight, and his face became softer, less angular. And if that weren't enough, he started to act like me. He started to copy my habits, my phrases, my jokes. Even my clothes were his now. He started wearing the same t-shirts as me. Even the Vans shoes that I always bought for myself were now his choice. He became me. And no one around me noticed. My friends, my family, everyone saw him as me. Everyone said it wasn't weird, that this is how it's supposed to be. They even started joking that couples start to look alike, but it wasn't normal. It was something horrible. I tried to explain to them that this wasn't the person I met. I tried to show them pictures that showed how much he had changed, how his face no longer looked like the one I saw 2 months ago. But no one believed me. It was as if I was the only one who saw it. I remember the moment I realized this was all getting out of hand. It was 2 months ago when he stood next to me in the mirror. I looked at his face, and it was mine. He had become me, not just in appearance, but in spirit. He talked like me, joked like me. He had become my clone, and I couldn't understand how that was possible. How could he become me? It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was in a panic. I couldn't understand what was happening. He was doing everything I did. He even started taking my medications, going to the same places I went, meeting my friends, acting like the same person as me. It was like a scary version of me. I tried to run away, to close myself off from him, but he was still there. Even when I was sitting in my apartment, he was there, like a shadow everywhere I went. And the worst part was, No one noticed. Everyone was so caught up in the fact that it was him and not me that no one thought anything was wrong. Even my friends, when I tried to explain that he wasn't me, they would just laugh or say I was exaggerating, like it was just some weird joke or a game. But it wasn't a game. It was terrifyingly real. Now that I think about it, I realize that I can't stay in this life anymore. This person, or being that has become me, is destroying me. I have to do something. But what? How do I stop what has taken over my life? Maybe you think I'm just going crazy. Maybe I am crazy, but if you ever see him, you'll understand. You'll see that he has become me. And if that's true, then there's only one thing left for me to do. I have to end this. I began to feel my reality warping. Everything around me was becoming so familiar that it felt like it had happened before, over and over again, but with subtle changes. I tried to hold on, to focus on my life, on what I had once done. But Tony, Antonio, he was everywhere. He was a part of everything. I felt myself slowly losing myself in this world that felt foreign and at the same time too familiar. Every day I woke up to find him next to me. His eyes, his gaze, they were mine. His walk, his movements, even his gestures, they were like mine but alien. He looked at me the way I once looked at myself in the mirror before all this began. But I was no longer sure which of us was real. One day while I was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee, I caught his gaze. He was watching me, and there was something strange in his eyes, something I couldn't place. He didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there and watched. It was like he was watching me, like I was some object that needed to be studied, taken apart. I couldn't help the wave of anxiety that rose inside me. This wasn't the Tony I knew. This man or this thing that looked like him was something else. I could feel the coldness that he radiated, as if he was just a shell, and there was nothing inside but emptiness. This wasn't normal, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Why couldn't anyone notice? Why was everyone acting as if nothing had changed? Was I really going crazy? Was this some kind of side effect of stress or fatigue or something else? But when I looked at his face, I felt that it wasn't like that. This was more than just a misunderstanding. This was something sinister, unimaginable. I decided to talk to him about it. But when I opened my mouth to ask even one question, the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't get a single word out. I was paralyzed with fear. And as soon as I felt it, I realized it wasn't just him. It was me who was disappearing. He was consuming me. He was taking my life, my identity, my reality. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. And worst of all, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to get myself back. Every time I tried to do something for myself, he was there. If I went to the store, he would follow me, hiding in the shadows. If I sat in a cafe, he would sit at the table next to me, looking at me as if I were an echo of himself. Even my own thoughts began to distort. I could no longer distinguish my thoughts from his. When I was alone, I would hear his voice in my head, saying the same things I thought when I looked at myself in the mirror. I couldn't figure out if it was his influence or if it was my own thoughts that had turned into something alien. Everything was merging, and I was losing control. One night when I woke up, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed looking at me. I froze in fear. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there and watched. I didn't know what to do. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was so close that I could feel his breath without him even touching me. And that was the scariest thing. I felt him penetrating me, my mind, and I was no longer sure where I ended and where he began. He started doing things that seemed normal, but each time they became more disturbing. He bought the same products as me. He wore the same clothes as me. When I chose a movie, he chose the same one. It was like he knew what I would do, what I would think. He was always one step ahead of me, and I couldn't understand how that was possible. He started using my words, my phrases, and every time I tried to regain my individuality, he did something to take that opportunity away from me. One day I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to talk to him. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. I picked up my phone and texted my friend, but as soon as I touched the screen, I noticed the message had already been sent. It was sent by him, Tony. He took my phone and sent the message for me. He did it as if he were me. I couldn't understand what was happening, but that was the last straw. I decided to go to a therapist. Maybe if someone could hear me, I could understand what was going on. I went to the office, and when I walked in, I saw a familiar picture, a chair, soft sofas, a cup of coffee. But when I sat down and turned to the therapist, I saw him, his face, his eyes, his gaze. He was there, sitting in another chair, looking at me. It was not just a coincidence. It was him. I was back where it all began, and I didn't know what to do. Maybe I really am going crazy, But how do I explain what is happening? How do I explain this feeling when you know you are being taken away, but you can't do anything to stop it? Each day became more and more frightening. I tried to hold on to some small sense of normalcy, but with each passing day, it felt like reality was morphing into something else entirely. I would wake up and everything would be familiar, but also foreign. I didn't know who I was. This wasn't the life I once knew. But most importantly, I didn't know who I really was anymore. Tony or Antonio, I started to lose track of time, and it became difficult to distinguish where it ended and I began. At some point, I realized that every day I woke up thinking that everything would go back to normal, but it didn't. He was there. He was everywhere. His image recreated my reality. Even if I tried to run away, he found a way to appear. It was like a disease, like a virus that entered me and consumed everything. I kept trying to tell myself that this was just a weird phase, that I was stressed, or that this was all just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This couldn't be a dream. He was there. I saw his shadow reflected in the mirror, his face becoming mine, his movements merging with mine. This wasn't an illusion. I felt myself disappear. One evening, as I sat on my couch, unable to take it anymore, I decided to try to do something that could get me out of this nightmare. I decided to write down everything that was happening, to at least understand what was happening. Maybe if I could see it on paper, I would be able to figure out what was happening. My hand shook as I picked up the pen and began to write. At first, it was simple sentences. He is with me again. I can't get rid of him. He is me. But with each word, I felt the words become heavy, dragging me into the depths of something I couldn't understand. I tried to write and explain to myself that I could cope, that I could find a way out. But the more I wrote, the less I believed in my words. I couldn't stop, and this paper became more and more filled with words that lost their meaning. When I stopped, I looked at what I had written. This was not my letter. This was his voice, his words, his thoughts. He was inside me. I felt my hands turn to ice. I tried to get up from the couch, but I felt his presence again, as if he was behind me. I turned around abruptly, and there he was. He was there, right in front of me. His eyes, those same eyes I knew so well, were now staring at me with an empty expression. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching me. This wasn't normal. I realized that this wasn't just a perception issue anymore. This was something much more terrifying. This wasn't just a trick, not a hallucination. This was real, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. But what could I do? I couldn't just walk away from him. He was a part of me. He was everywhere. I decided to try what I thought was my last chance. I went to a place that always made me feel safe, a lake where I often went to be alone. I thought that if I could just be there, away from all these thoughts and fear, maybe I could find a solution. But as soon as I got there, it became clear to me that I was wrong. He was there. I stood on the shore looking at the calm water, trying to calm my thoughts. But his shadow was there, close by, on the opposite bank, like his reflection in the water. I felt his gaze. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I could cope. But in that moment it occurred to me that he was not just watching me. He had become a part of me, and I could not escape. He was everywhere. I returned home, sat on my bed and closed my eyes, trying to gather the strength to calm down a little. But before I fell asleep, I felt his hands touching my skin. It was almost physical. I couldn't understand what was happening. I felt him penetrating me, his thoughts becoming mine. My body became alien, and I could no longer control it. It was like waking up, but not from a dream. It was like realizing that I was losing myself. I couldn't be the person I used to be anymore, and I didn't know how to stop it. At that moment, I knew I had to find an answer. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't let him take everything I once was. I had to find a way to stop him before he consumed me completely. It was morning when I woke up, but I didn't feel the slightest relief. With each new day, each morning became more and more difficult, as if reality was squeezing me and the air was becoming thick and viscous. I got up, trying to ignore the chill of fear that did not leave me, and went through the usual day, performing automatic actions like a zombie. It seemed as if the world around me continued to exist, and I was torn from it, absorbed by something much more dangerous and inexplicable. The night still brought no peace. Dreams and nightmares intertwined, mixing with what was happening to me in reality. His face kept appearing before me, like a ghost I could not exorcise. In these moments, I felt his presence creeping into my mind, rewriting my thoughts, making me doubt that I had ever been myself. Every day became a new struggle. I could no longer be sure of what was happening around me. I didn't know who was real, me or him. I tried to resist, But with every step I took, it seemed like he was everywhere. His shadow was always there, even when I tried to find shelter. I closed my eyes, but his image was in my mind, like a recorded loop, not allowing me to forget. With each passing minute, new fears filled me, and I began to feel myself losing control. I couldn't trust myself anymore. I tried to find a way out, but maybe there was no way out. Maybe everything I was experiencing was part of something much deeper and more incomprehensible. He told me that I couldn't get out, that I was inescapable. I couldn't stop thinking about how I needed to get rid of him. But how? It was like trying to rip out my soul, to leave all my memories behind, to be free of him. And yet I knew that he wasn't just part of my fear. He was part of me, part of what I had already become. When I went to the lake again, to get away from this horror for a moment, I noticed how it had changed. The water was not the same as before. It seemed murky, dark, like the shadow that was haunting me. I sat on the shore trying to concentrate, but I could not shake the feeling that every movement, every look could give away his presence. He was here. He was in the water, in the air, in every cell of my body. I felt his gaze even when I wasn't looking in his direction. He was watching. He was watching me tirelessly, as if he were a part of this world, and I was just his reflection. I heard him in my inner voice, which was becoming more and more like his. His words, his thoughts, they captured me like a virus, penetrated my every step, every thought. But with each passing day, I began to doubt more and more. I couldn't understand if it was real or if it was all my fears and nervousness that I couldn't cope with. Everything seemed unreal, and this uncertainty about reality became unbearable. I couldn't find answers, and it was depressing me. I tried to think of what I could do, but it all came down to the fact that I couldn't fight what was happening. I was trapped, and the only thing that was left was my fight with my own mind. My attempts to escape this nightmare were becoming more and more pointless. The more I tried, the more it consumed me. I started to think that I wasn't strong enough to resist this. He was too strong. And then I realized that maybe I needed to accept that this wasn't going to end. What if this was my reality now? What if I couldn't get my life back? I tried to lock myself away, to hide from his gaze, but his presence was everywhere, in every room, in every corner. He was there, and I couldn't escape him. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't go back. I was part of this game, and he was probably the main player. Now I realized that maybe my whole life had been just a preparation for this meeting with him. Everything I had once considered real was now part of his power over me. Maybe I wouldn't find a way out. Maybe this was my destiny to be a part of him, and maybe I had to learn to live with it. Time ceased to have meaning. I could no longer distinguish what day it was, what morning it was. Each moment dragged on and disappeared so quickly that I lost all sense of duration. There was only a sense of infinity, as if I were stuck in some kind of limbo. When I looked at the world, it seemed as if everything happening around me was just an illusion. I could not tell where reality ended and my perception began. Everything merged together, and in this continuous fog, I tried to find even a small piece of certainty. He was still watching me, though I wasn't sure he was there in a physical sense anymore. His presence was something more sinister than just a shadow. It was like something that permeated the space around me, that became part of my every step, my every breath. Even if I couldn't see him, I felt his gaze, his influence, as if he was in my head, in my thoughts, and his shadows lurked in the deepest corners of my soul. I tried to be strong. I tried to cope with this nightmare, although I did not know how. My consciousness resisted, fought, but in the end I understood that all my struggle was in vain. I tried to look for some answers, questions that could bring me back to peace, but each answer only deepened me into this abyss of horror. All this time, I told myself that I could get out. I thought that if I was determined enough, brave enough, I could take back control, but it all felt like a lie. Every attempt to fight only led me to a greater sense of hopelessness. At some point, I decided that maybe it was best to just accept him. If I couldn't beat him, maybe I should understand him. In my mind, I tried to come to terms with him, to make peace with him, to let him be a part of me. But it wasn't as easy as I thought. The more I tried to accept him, the stronger he became. He permeated my every thought like a virus, infecting me with his fears and doubts. I remembered how, as a child, I had once bottled up my fears and tried to avoid the dark places where my nightmares hid. I had thought that if I avoided those places, if I was careful enough, I could keep myself safe. But now I understood that fear was not always avoidable. It stalked you, it found you even when you were hiding. It entered your life without asking permission. And now that fear was no longer just a part of me, it was me. It was getting hard to think about how I couldn't find a place for myself in the world anymore. I couldn't figure out what was happening to my feelings. Everything was becoming more and more blurry, and I felt like my identity was dissolving, like I wasn't myself anymore. I wasn't just a person. I was part of this nightmare, part of its game, and maybe I wasn't able to get out of it. But there was still a tiny spark of hope inside me. I was still trying to find an answer. Even though I knew it might be futile, I had to find some way to cope. I couldn't give in completely. I couldn't let him take everything that was left. I wanted to go back. I wanted to find the life I once knew. But every time I tried to step into the light, I only felt darker. He was there, everywhere. And I knew that this fight could only end one way. Either I would remain in this darkness forever, or I didn't know what would happen next. But something inside told me that there was still a chance. Not for me, but for what once was me. Every day I tried to hide. I locked myself in my room, stared at the empty walls, and tried to imagine that I had once been different. But it became increasingly impossible. Every glance at my shadow in the mirror seemed alien. I tried to understand how I had ended up in this nightmare, how I had allowed my life to turn upside down like this. I continued to search for answers in the void, but with every step I took, I felt myself becoming more and more disconnected from reality. And maybe I didn't need to look for a way out anymore. Maybe I just needed to learn to live here, in this place, with this being who seemed to be connected to me forever. I didn't know how much time had passed since I first felt his presence. It could have been a week or a month. Time had become something vague and inconsequential to me. I was beginning to get used to this state of uncertainty, to the fact that I was surrounded by something strange, foggy, inhuman. There were no longer any clear boundaries that would separate reality from my fears. Everything was intertwined into one endless stream of sensations. Every day I woke up with a heaviness on my chest, as if something invisible was squeezing my breath. And with each passing moment, it became harder to believe that I had ever been anything else. In this place, in this emptiness, I felt my mind, slowly but surely, begin to break. It seemed that I no longer existed, that I had simply become part of this obscurantism, that it had swallowed me whole. He was getting closer, always there. I couldn't see him, I couldn't hear him, but I felt him. His presence was insistent, as if he were inside me, in my every move. I could no longer shake the feeling that he was echoing in my every step, in my every thought. Fear became my companion, and its weight was almost tangible. Sometimes I felt like if I closed my eyes, everything would disappear. It was my way of escaping, even though I knew there was no hiding place. Everything that was happening was too real to be a simple nightmare. My own shadow was not my own, and its movements reminded me that I no longer had control over myself or my surroundings. I tried to scream, but the sounds stuck in my throat wouldn't come out. It seemed that I was in a space where sounds and words lost all meaning. It wasn't silence. It was a state in which there was no room for anything alive. I tried to speak, thinking that maybe words could give me back control, but there were none. I was mute in this endless, ominous space. My body was like a prison. I couldn't move, but at the same time, everything was so alive that every moment dragged on and felt like pain. It wasn't just a physical lack of freedom. I felt my ability to think, my ability to make decisions, my mind weakly resisting. But I knew that its strength was depleting. I tried to remember how I ended up here. It was like I was standing on the edge, looking into the abyss. But I couldn't remember what brought me to this state. Some vague, unclear moments from the past floated into my head, but I couldn't put them together. It felt like a bad dream from which it was impossible to wake up. Deep down, I knew I was on the edge. Everything I once knew about myself was gone. I was like leaves being blown away by the wind. I had once been a living being, but now it felt like I had lost my essence. He had taken it, dissolved it, and now I was part of what was left behind. I was weak, exhausted, but the worst thing was that I couldn't go back. I was no longer myself. One night when the darkness around me seemed especially thick, I felt something new. Not pain, not fear, but something else. Perhaps it was the realization that I was no longer fighting. I was no longer resisting this place, this state, and something inside me gave in. I realized that maybe I shouldn't fight it. Maybe I should just accept it, because I was part of this shadow, and it had become part of me. And when I realized that, it was like everything stopped. My heart began to beat slowly, steadily, as if accepting its inevitable fate. There was no fear, no pain. There was only peace, a complete acceptance that I no longer existed in the form I once did. I had become part of this darkness, and maybe that was the only way to stay alive. It was inside me, and I no longer felt like there was anything to run from. The shadows that had once been my enemies were now my allies. I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't know what would happen next, but in that abyss, in the emptiness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Maybe this was the end, or maybe the beginning of something else. But in that moment, I was ready for any outcome, because I was no longer trying to fight. With each passing minute, I felt the space around me becoming more and more cramped and unreal. Sounds seemed to disappear, and I was left alone with this obscurantism that was consuming me. There was no room for action, no opportunity for thought. All that remained was absolute silence and the feeling that I no longer belonged to myself. My eyes moved along the walls, but they could not find a way out, could not find any signs of life. In this place, I was like a forgotten shadow, lost in space. My body no longer perceived the world around me as something I could control. It had become part of what surrounded me. I could not shake the feeling that reality itself was pressing down on me, and that every move I made was my last. With every breath, I was getting closer to the inevitable. He was there. I could feel him. It was as if his shadow was spreading throughout the room, penetrating every corner. There were no words, no images, only his presence. He was part of this space, like the air I couldn't breathe because it was filled with something alien and frightening. I tried to take a step, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It felt like I was standing on the edge of some kind of fall, where every step could be my last. I felt fear taking over me, and there was no point in resisting. Everything I once knew was gone. I became just a part of this place, a part of this nightmare, where there was no salvation, no end. The darkness was everywhere. There was no warmth, no cold, just an emptiness that grew deeper with each passing moment. My thoughts were confused. I couldn't focus, but I knew he was there, and I couldn't escape him. It wasn't a physical presence, but something much stronger and more powerful. I couldn't figure out what exactly he wanted from me. And what's worse, I wasn't sure he could leave me alone. My memory wasn't helping anymore. I tried to remember something important that could give me back control, but everything in my head was scattered, blurred, as if someone was wiping away all traces. I tried to remember how I got here, but I couldn't find an answer. It was as if I was just thrown here, into this state from which there was no way back. I began to realize that maybe I just wouldn't get out of this state. It wasn't just a place, it was like a prison, and maybe I had become part of what was consuming me. There was no point in fighting. As I stood there trying to figure out what was happening, the darkness began to part a little. But what I saw made me freeze in place again. Where there had been nothing before, there were now shapes, and it was so strange that I couldn't believe my eyes. I was standing in front of this creature, which was slowly moving towards me. Maybe it wasn't what I thought, but I saw him. He wasn't quite human, not quite something I could understand. His outline was indistinct, as if his body was made of fog. All I could make out were his eyes glowing in the darkness. They were eerie and bright, like twin flames that stared at me with cold determination. I couldn't move. I couldn't close my eyes. His gaze was so strong that I felt it penetrate my soul. Every thought, every fear that I tried to hide became clear to him. He knew everything about me, even the things I didn't understand. I knew I was standing in front of something that couldn't be destroyed, couldn't be defeated. And maybe at some point I accepted that this was the moment that was waiting for me. I was part of this shadow, part of this strange and scary world. And maybe this was my destiny. But there was no pain. There was no fear. There was just this darkness, this empty space in which I became one of its components. And maybe I shouldn't be afraid of anything anymore. Story 5. They say that the Holt mansion was cursed long before the blood of an unrecognizable body stained its cold wooden floors. I laughed at these rumors for a long time, knowing for sure that they were just fairy tales for poor country children. They always like to make up stories about mysterious houses just to scare each other. A curse? Old nonsense. I did not believe in what such people believed. I had no interest in mysticism or the supernatural. City life didn't suit me, and all those stories about ghosts and unsolved mysteries just seemed ridiculous. I was just tired of the noise, the bustle of the city, the people who walked the streets without noticing each other, tired of everything that reminded me of who I didn't want to be. I wanted solitude. I wanted silence. And when my grandmother, with whom I hadn't spoken for a long time, declared me the heir to this old mansion in her will, I may have been a little hasty, but I still decided to take it for myself. It wasn't just an empty building, covered in dust and abandoned by everyone. It was a place that I thought could give me what I had been looking for. I could start all over again. I was sure of it. When I arrived at Holt, the first thing that struck me was the smell. It was heavy, as if years of dust and mildew had ingrained itself into the walls, the floors, the air I breathed. There was nothing pleasant about it, but I stepped inside anyway. It had been years since anyone had set foot in these rooms alive, It stood forgotten at the edge of town, as if the spell that kept it isolated would not let go. Holt Manor was like a fairy tale that no one wanted to read. The house seemed alive. It gave off the feeling that it was full of secrets, hidden under layers of centuries of dust. I never liked old buildings, especially not like this. Lots of rooms, long hallways, doors that creaked, as if they were reminders of the past, of those who had once lived here. But I was sure that it didn't matter. I didn't believe in curses. I didn't believe in ghosts. It was all just icing on the cake, making the place interesting. As I walked through the house, I immediately noticed that everything was in terrible condition. The wooden beams were starting to crack from age. The wallpaper was peeling, and the windows were dirty. But none of that could stop me. I was already in another world, in another time, and I was going to fix it all up, put it in order. I thought it would be an easy job. But the further I went into the house, the more it seemed to me that it was not just old and abandoned. It was different. It knew I was there. It knew who I was. I felt the air getting thicker, as if it were shrinking around me. Suddenly I heard a sound, a strange sound, as if someone was knocking on the wall. It was not because the house was old and something might break there. No, it was a sound like a sigh, like breathing. I ignored it. I walked on. As soon as I entered the drawing room, I felt a strange weight on my shoulders. Everything was covered in dust, hunched over paintings hung on the walls, and old canvases lay on the floor. I walked deeper and noticed something dark obscuring the light refracting through the old window panes. Then I saw it, a body, a man, or what had once been a man. He was lying on the floor. His chest was torn open, as if he had been cut with a knife, almost ritualistically. Symbols I couldn't make out were carved into his skin, bleeding and dark, as if he was part of something I wasn't supposed to see. But the worst thing was his eyes. They were gone, not ripped out, not taken. No, they were just gone, as if someone had sucked them out, leaving empty sockets. I couldn't believe my eyes. I felt like this couldn't be real. At that moment, I felt the whole world go silent, the air freeze. I stood there, unable to move, until I heard footsteps running up the steps, as if someone was hurrying here. My first impulse was to call the police. I managed to grab my phone and dial a number, but the voice on the other end seemed far away. I told them I had found a body. I felt like I had forgotten how to breathe. They asked me what I had seen, but I couldn't tell them anything coherent. I just kept repeating that I had found a body. I remembered the sirens flickering in the darkness and reflecting faintly off the walls. But when they arrived, they found nothing. The police claimed there was no trace of me, and no trace of the dead man. They tried to convince me that it was just an accident, some random ritual or even drug chemistry. But I knew it wasn't. I knew that something was wrong with this place, and when they left, I couldn't shake the strange feeling. I didn't know where it came from, but it seemed like this house would never let me go. I was sure that this place had awakened something in me. I felt like something dark and ancient was starting to wake up in the very soul of the house. And I knew one thing. It belonged to me now, and its secrets too. The next day came with the same sense of heaviness as the night before. When the light came into the house, I realized that nothing had changed. Everything was just as cold, just as oppressive. I stood in the hallway and looked around, as if this house had become more than just a collection of antiques. It had become a part of me, its tense atmosphere seeping into me, as if I were a prisoner within its walls. I knew I had to leave. I knew there should have been some other reaction, but something about this place held me. I felt like I was being watched all the time, even when I couldn't see anyone around me. The walls, the floors, the furniture, everything seemed to be watching me. Every creak and rustle was a warning. They were seemingly insignificant, but with each passing day they became more and more obvious. Sometimes I thought I heard quiet whispers, as if someone was calling me. Sometimes it was just the sound of the wind, but at other times I knew it wasn't the wind. It was something else. I tried to ignore these feelings and focus on what I needed to do. I needed to sort out the inheritance, deal with this damn house and move on. I needed to figure out what to do with this place, what was going on here. But every corner, every room gave me these strange, fuzzy feelings. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew the house was more than just empty. Deciding to do some soul-searching and understanding of the place, I began to explore the house. It was huge, and it was obvious that years after the last residents had left, there had been no attempt at maintaining order. I noticed that over time, its hidden corners began to become more and more attractive to me, as if each of them hid its own story. One of these rooms was Nana's old library, which I had heard of but never imagined to be so large. There seemed to be something there, among the dusty books and dark shelves, that drew my gaze. I remembered it when I noticed something strange in the shadows at the end of the hallway. The light seemed to be reluctant to penetrate these parts of the house, and I felt that everything was becoming even more gloomy. I was sure that if I had not gone there, I would have felt uneasy. I could not ignore the fact that somehow, unconsciously, I was drawn there. I walked into the library. From the outside, it seemed ordinary. Dark shelves, old volumes, worn bindings. But as soon as I found myself in the very center, I felt the air change. It became heavy, saturated with old age and something else that I could not understand. The rustle of pages as if the books were trying to communicate something. And suddenly I realized the old computer was on. It worked. How could that be? I sat down next to it, feeling its cold screen reflect the faint light from the window. I looked around again, and then my attention was drawn to the keyboard. Could this be the same thing my grandmother used? I was so confused that I almost missed the strange sensation. My attention was suddenly drawn to the strange writing on the screen. It wasn't letters. It wasn't just a system error. It was symbols. I couldn't understand them, but a tingling sensation ran through me. It wasn't random. Images flashed across the screen. They were photographs, old pictures of people I'd never met. All I could make out were faces, distorted. The eyes in the photographs had been cut out, just like the body. I felt my throat go dry. This screen wasn't just a computer. It was a door. It was something that might be connected to what was happening in this house. I quickly pulled away, closing the screen, but the thought was nagging at me. Why did Grandma leave that computer on? Why were those images still in its memory? For a moment, I thought I could hear a voice, barely audible, whispering from inside the mirror. It was quiet, but distinctly familiar. I couldn't figure out what it was, but the voice couldn't belong to anyone alive. It was alien, a foreign force that could be either part of or an enemy of this house. I didn't know what it meant, but the moment I approached the mirror again, it became clear to me I was not alone. The whisper was getting closer. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. The mirror hanging in the corner reflected my face. But not just that. In its reflection, I saw a figure, a person, or what had once been a person. It was a woman with dark eyes, something all too familiar, something that reminded me of my grandmother. But her features were missing. Her vitality was missing. It was just a blank stare, distorted, dark, deep. I felt my breathing become heavy, and waves of fear began to wash over me. But I knew one thing. There was no turning back from this. I went back to the computer to try to find something that would explain what was happening. And when I looked at the screen again, I realized it had changed. Words had appeared in place of the old photographs. Not all of them were clear, but I read one clearly. You will be next. It was a foreshadowing, and I realized that now it was my duty to find out what was hidden in this house. Who was in those photographs? Who was that voice? Who else was hiding here? But I already knew the answers would not be simple. It had been a few days since I had first encountered what was happening in the house. All that remained after that encounter with the mirror and the computer was a sense of inevitability. I felt like I needed to unravel all the mysteries of this place, but each new discovery led me into more chaos. It was as if the house was trying to warn me of something, but it was itself the cause of what was happening. I felt its walls beginning to press in on me more and more, forcing me to seek answers to questions I didn't know I should ask. Yet I couldn't leave. I couldn't leave this house because no matter how hard I tried, it pulled me in. The mirror, the computer, the whispers, it all became part of my reality. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. As if I was already a part of this damn place. That day, I went back to the library to look through the old books. I thought maybe there was some clue that would help me understand what was going on. Every book on the shelves was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had touched them for decades. I pulled out the first book I came across, and despite its age and wear, I noticed a strange image on the cover. It was a black figure standing in the dark woods, a figure with eyes that seemed to follow my every move. Opening the book, I found strange symbols in it, exactly the same as those I had seen on the man's body in the past. But here they were more detailed, like instructions. And one phrase, written in an ancient, almost forgotten handwriting, caught my attention. It was short, but it melted in the air, as if it were a living being in itself. Shadows see through blood. I didn't know what it meant, but something inside me was unsure. Shadows? Blood? I tried to figure out how it related to what was happening, but my thoughts kept getting confused. Absorbed in my book, I didn't notice how the room had darkened. Suddenly, I realized that the sun had disappeared outside the window, and the house had become much darker than usual. Looking around, I noticed that the shadows in the corners of the room had become unnaturally long. They were moving. At first, these were only small movements, as if the wind was blowing through the house, but then they became more and more distinct. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The whispers I heard earlier grew louder again, but this time they were different. They weren't simple voices. These were commands, demanding that I do something. I stood up abruptly, trying to shake off these thoughts, but at that moment one of the shadows moved to the table and began to slowly stretch out its hands towards the book. I screamed, pushing her away, and in that moment the book slipped from my hands, falling to the floor. The impact caused its pages to fall open, and a new image appeared before me. The distorted face of a woman, a face I knew. It was her, my grandmother, but there was no life in her eyes. She was just a figure drawn in a book, but her eyes were the same as the body I found in the house. Empty, dark, dead. I felt my legs give way, and I sank to my knees. These shadows, these whispers, it was not just an illusion. It was not just a strange coincidence. I knew it was connected to my past, to my family history. I jumped up and grabbed the book, pulling out its pages to find answers. Each page was filled with mysterious symbols and texts, but one in particular caught my attention. On it were written the words, "Be silent when the shadows begin to speak. Their breath is your last chance." I looked around the room, feeling the atmosphere become even more oppressive. The shadows seemed to come alive, coming closer, but not too close. I could only hear their breathing, which was almost inaudible. It was a breathing that was not mine. It was the breathing of something that was watching me. I felt panic seize me, but at the same time, some force from within kept me holding on. I glanced at the book and noticed that the last image on its pages showed the same symbol that was carved into the man's body, as if it were a map, and I was its last trace, the last one to walk this path. You will be next. The shadows continued to move. They were everywhere. I needed to know what this all meant and how I had ended up in the center of this nightmare. I couldn't leave the house. It wouldn't let me go. It was a part of me, and I knew one thing. I had to keep going. But where? How could I get out of this labyrinth if every step only led me deeper? I closed the book and stood up, realizing I had a choice. One path led to the past, the other to a future I could still change, and I had to choose whose side I would be on. But I knew one thing. I was not alone, and I could not escape the answers. A few days had passed since I had found the book and used it to delve deeper into the mysteries of this place. I began to feel everything around me becoming more dense and threatening. The house no longer seemed like just an old mansion, full of dust and neglect. It was something more. Every crack in it, every creak in the floor felt like it was part of something alive, watching me. I could no longer ignore what was happening. Everything I knew, everything I felt, was telling me that I had to do something. Every night I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, trying to comprehend what I had learned. And every night, when I fell asleep, I woke up in a cold sweat, hearing sounds that came from the darkest corners of the house. Strange footsteps, rustling sounds as if someone or something was wandering around the house. But the worst thing was that I increasingly felt like someone or something was looking at me from the darkness, not hiding its presence. I knew that I was not the only one in this house. That night, when I picked up the book again, I noticed another strange detail. The page with the symbol, similar to the one I had seen on the dead man's body, was slightly more damaged than the rest. I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed it before. I carefully turned the page and found text that seemed to have been written for a reason. The words were almost meaningless, but their power was palpable in the air. When you feel like you have to go, you won't be able to escape. When they come, you will become part of them. My body went cold again. Those words seemed to flood my soul with fear. I felt the air around me tighten as if I was trapped. The shadows I saw were not just figures in the darkness. They were not just a play of light and shadow. They were entities, beings lurking in the corners of this world, ready to make contact with those who dared to cross the border. The realization paralyzed me. I felt my mind begin to give in, the fog in my thoughts turning into cold reality. I couldn't allow myself to despair. This place, this house, wasn't going to let me go. And I knew that if I didn't find a way to resist these forces, I would be at their mercy. But how do you fight something that wasn't part of this world? How do you fight a shadow that bides its time? I closed the book and looked around the room again. Everything looked the same as before, but something was wrong. The shadows weren't just moving, they were already following me. They were close. I could feel them, somewhere behind me in the corner. But when I turned around, there was nothing. It was as if they were just waiting for me to get distracted. And then for a moment, when I wasn't looking in that direction, I saw a small figure, black as the shadow itself, move along the wall. Not just a shadow, but something alive. In an instant, the figure disappeared around the corner. My feet, as if of their own accord, carried me in that direction. But I stopped before I reached the corner. I had to be smart. If I kept going, I would be led there again. I knew too much, felt too much to just go there. Still, I realized I had to find out what was lurking in that house. I couldn't stay in the dark. Did I think I'd one day walk through doors and corners and find myself in a safe zone? No, I had to figure it out, find answers. That evening, I stood up, picking up the poker again. It was useless, but at that moment, it was the only way I had some illusion of control. I stood in the center of the hall, listening to the noise around me. The cold and darkness pressed on me, but I knew that one day I would have to get through this. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the empty walls, and the fear inside me tormented me. It seemed that every turn led me into more darkness. Shadows moved behind me, and I did not know what would happen if I took another step. But I still moved forward. When I reached the library, I knew something had changed. I didn't have to go to the mirror to know it. There was something in the air that made me wary. Everything was getting too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned away from the door, but from the peephole on the wall, I saw that gaze again. Black eyes that couldn't be human. And that gaze was directed at me. My heart sank. Grandma. Something was wrong in her mirror. It was like she was looking at me from behind that window, watching me become part of this nightmare. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find a way out. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't leave anymore. Hours passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about that look in the mirror. That moment when I met eyes with something that couldn't be real. I stood in that hallway where the stars don't shine, and in the shadow of that house, I felt even more alien and helpless. This house didn't just hide secrets. It was a secret that I had become a part of. And strangely enough, it was in that moment that I realized I can't leave it. Not anymore. The dark room where I found the mirror was the last place I wanted to go, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like an irresistible pull, as if I was forced to continue despite all my fears and instincts for self-preservation. My feet were leading me, and I couldn't say it was a choice. I wasn't sure how conscious it was. I could have clenched my fists and walked away, but something I could barely understand kept me on this path. As I approached the door, my gaze fell on the mirror again. Everything was as before, but I knew that there was more to the glass than just a reflection. I saw it cloud slightly, as if someone was breathing on its surface from within. And in that moment, I realized that the mirror was not just glass. It was a door to a world where I was no longer the master. I pressed myself against the door and tried to turn the handle carefully. It was unlocked. With that, I stepped inside. It was strange to be in this room, something so alien and yet so familiar. The smell of dust, the worn books and cracked floors, all of it seemed part of a reality I was trying to understand but couldn't control. I took a step towards the mirror. It was no longer just an object. It seemed to attract me. I came closer, and my eyes slid over the reflection. It was not my reflection. In the mirror stood a person who did not look like me. It was a woman, but her features were vague, washed out, like a shadow frozen in immobility. I tried to stand up, to look, to see her. She was silent, but her eyes burned with such a fiery light that it was difficult for me to hold her gaze. I took a step back, but it didn't help. As I moved away from the mirror, the light in the room began to dim. It disappeared, and the room swallowed me in its darkness. It seemed like I was still here, but I no longer felt this world. There was a feeling of emptiness inside me, and this emptiness was stronger than me. Shadows began to move. I saw them in the corners, but they weren't just moving. They were approaching me. I tried to get back to the door, but I couldn't find it. I searched for my way, but the room seemed to be changing. Everything became unsteady, blurry, as if reality itself was not stable. Suddenly, I felt one of the shadows slip past me. It was so close that I thought I could feel its coldness, its invisible presence. I jerked and turned, but there was no one in the darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed, but once I was in this world, I lost track of time. I was left alone in the darkness. The mirror reflected me again, but now I saw myself standing in an empty room, surrounded by something misty and mysterious. My own shadow seemed not to be mine. It moved without repeating my movements, without obeying me. It was a shadow that was not a part of me. And at that moment I understood, I can no longer control this house. This mansion has become my prison. In that moment, I felt like I was disappearing. I had become part of something bigger than myself. I was trapped in a world where time and space no longer mattered. I had lost control, I had lost my way, and it seemed like I had lost everything that mattered to me. I stood in the center of this emptiness, trying to understand what was happening to me. My mind exploded with the realization that I was not alone, and everything I knew before no longer mattered. Fear had become a part of me, a part of this place, and now I was connected to this house. As its last inhabitant, as its prisoner, all that was left for me was to accept my fate. As the darkness swallowed me completely, I heard a soft whisper. It was like an exclamation from the distant past, from the dark world that lived in this house. It was a voice, but who was it? The darkness in the mansion wasn't just the absence of light. It was more than that. It seeped into me, seeping into my skin, and weaving into my thoughts like a sinister web that grew thicker with each passing hour. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd entered this strange world, but as the lights in the house began to dim again, I realized I was lost in its depths. The mirror, it was still there, still standing in the corner of that dark room. But now it wasn't just reflecting me. I felt it beckoning, as if it had become something alive, as if it weren't just glass, but a portal through which I could peer into another reality, where everything was messed up, where my own shadows were not just images, but entities. Each step towards the mirror seemed endless. I walked across this ancient floor, knowing that something was waiting for me in the darkness. The shadows moving around me grew thicker and thicker, and I felt their gaze, their presence. Something was watching me, watching my every move, my every breath. I tried not to think about it, but the anxiety grew with each passing moment. As I approached the mirror, I felt a strange chill emanating from its surface. It wasn't just the cold glass. It was an atmosphere that squeezed my heart, making me feel like everything I was doing was unnecessary, that I shouldn't be here. And yet, I couldn't tear my gaze away from that ominous reflection. My hands were shaking as I reached them out to the surface of the mirror, and at that moment, it began to pulsate slightly, like a living creature waiting for me to step inside. I would like to say that I realized that this was madness, but something in this house made me lose control of myself. There was something in this house that attracted me, that made me forget about the fear and pain. My heart began to beat faster, and I took a step forward. I could not retreat. Sometimes in life, there comes a point when we simply lose the opportunity to turn back, when it is impossible to return to what was before. It was like a fall that could not be stopped. I walked through the mirror. I never thought it was possible, but here I was, standing in another world. And this world was not like the one I had come from. It was darkness, swallowed by darkness itself, without a sign of life. Everything around me seemed darkened, empty, as if it had once existed, but now it was simply gone. The shadows that had once moved around me were now part of this space. I felt them pulling me, trying to swallow me, make me part of this darkness. I took a step forward, but the air became thick, heavy. It was filled with something ancient and sinister. Every movement was difficult, as if I were moving in a viscous liquid. Everything around me was dead, and I knew I was not here alone. The shadows began to grow. They weren't just moving, they were taking shape. I could make out human figures in their outlines, but they were distorted, misshapen, like echoes of some terrifying, nightmarish reality. I couldn't figure out what it was, and yet it all seemed familiar. These figures were part of what I was trying so hard to understand. I turned around and realized that the mirror was gone. It was just swallowed up. There was nothing in its place. This world gave me no way back. I hadn't been here by choice, but I was a part of it now. I felt the walls closing in, an unimaginable weight pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was fading into this dead space. Something moved in the shadows. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was watching me. It was always there, like an insatiable hunger, something that haunted me, never giving me a chance to catch my breath. I tried to find a way out, but I didn't know where to go. My gaze fell on one of the figures in the shadows. It looked human, but its eyes were empty. It moved, but not like humans. It was something else, something alien. It was what I had been searching for in this house. My soul creaked with realization. I was trapped, and it was no accident. I stood before it, and it began to approach. I felt it slowly, step by step, filling the space with its presence. Something about this creature was familiar. It was something I couldn't place, but something in my memory began to respond to its power. Maybe I wasn't the first to be here. Maybe there were many like me. And now I was part of this horror. I realized that this wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal to something greater than I could ever imagine. And I was part of it. But now that I was here, there was no turning back. All I could do was fight it, try to understand what was happening, and find a way to return. But the shadow was already too close. In this world of darkness and shadow, I felt every cell of my body shrinking. as if something invisible and powerful was pulling me deeper into this abyss. I tried to remember how I got here, but the memories seemed to crumble to dust, carried away by the endless flow of time. All that was left was a feeling of hopelessness filling the space around me, like a fog growing thicker with each passing moment. The shadows weren't just moving. They weren't just part of this world. They were alive. They were entities that could think and feel and strive for something. I could feel them watching me, studying my reactions, as if testing what I was capable of. But the worst thing was that I was starting to become part of this nightmare. I wasn't just here. I belonged in this world. I continued to walk forward, although my legs no longer yielded to me, as if they had become alien, did not obey. Every movement was heavy, as if I was trying to break free from someone's tenacious hands that were holding me in place. My mind was becoming less and less clear, and the voice in my head was repeating one single thought more and more insistently: "You will not leave. You will not leave here." And in that moment, I realized that this place, this mirror, this world was all part of an ancient force that had long forgotten what mercy was. I wasn't the first one to get here. Many people may have tried to get out, but this world was swallowing them. It was draining them. It wouldn't let go. But what was worse was the realization that I might not want to leave. All this time while I was trying to find a way out, I felt a strange pull to this place. It was beckoning me. It was drawing me in. My thoughts were becoming less and less clear, and I couldn't understand what exactly was forcing me to move on, to go deeper into this world, to search for what was really there. I looked back, and there was the shadow in front of me again. It was close. It wasn't scary. It was a part of me. I couldn't understand what it was, but its presence no longer made me afraid. I felt like we were merging, like our shadows were intertwining into a single form, as if we had become part of something greater. She reached out her hand to me. I didn't know why, but I didn't back away. I stepped forward, and her touch was like the merging of two souls. Everything I knew about myself, about reality, disappeared in that moment. I felt myself losing control, everything around me dissolving into this darkness. And then I understood. This world wasn't just a world. It was a living thing. It was a force that consumed everything. It wasn't evil. It wasn't good. It was simply a force that knew no bounds, and I might have become part of it. I was trapped, but it wasn't a physical trap. It was a trap of the mind, of perception, of how I perceived the world. I could no longer separate myself from what surrounded me. I was no longer human, neither alive nor dead. I had become something else, and there was no turning back. Every effort to get out, every desire to find a way out, grew weaker. I wasn't sure I'd ever wanted this. Maybe I was just part of something bigger, part of this house, this world, and maybe I'd never get out. Maybe I'd become part of this shadow, part of this ancient force. My eyes closed, but everything around me kept moving, kept existing. I was here. I was part of this world, and there was no pain, just emptiness. But what was worse was that I didn't know if I'd ever be free again, and maybe I'd never know if this was a nightmare or reality. Story 6. When I first walked into that store, the air felt off. It was thick, like the fog itself was settling on my lungs, like something old, invisible, but familiar, something that had always been there but no one had noticed. The doors rang, but there was no greeting, just a creak, like they weren't meant to open. And yet I walked through them anyway, like I was a done deal. A completely different world unfolded around me. The products on the shelves seemed unimportant, subordinated to their formula of existence, long since forgotten. I glanced down the aisles: energy drinks, chewing gum, spices that no longer belonged to this time. It was as if they were there not to sell anything, but to survive a little longer. I looked around, my gaze directed towards the mirror. I didn't want to look at myself, but something was pulling me. My reflection was like a shadow, too strong to be real. My hair was a mess, as if I hadn't paid attention to it for a long time. I could have tried to comb it, but it was too late. Looking in the mirror only confirmed that it would have been easier to accept that I had become this. My hair was tangled, stuck together in places from the residual traces of gel I hadn't washed out in a couple of days. It looked like a tame storm, its length barely long enough to fit into a regular hairstyle. I couldn't help but notice the way the faded eyeliner left marks on my skin, like a strange shadow that accentuated my skeletal features. Somehow it became clear to me that this wasn't just makeup anymore. It was a mask. Not a mask to hide, but to not exist. As if each stroke was an attempt to see myself in the mirror, but nothing more. There were deep circles under my eyes, and my pale face reflected all the questions I'd been asking myself over the past weeks. Who am I? Why am I here? The light-flooded space of the store offered no answers. It was empty, and its light was dead, as if it illuminated not so much me as my helplessness. I tried to distract myself, but my gaze returned to my reflection. I felt the cold tightening around my neck, as if I had become part of this lifeless world, part of something that had been erased and forgotten. I couldn't tear my gaze away from what I saw in the reflection, because I knew I hadn't changed. Everything was the same as before, but something deep inside me was different. I needed to choose something. Something important, but it was too difficult. I knew I wouldn't solve my problems here, that they would remain like those forgotten products on the shelves. They wouldn't disappear. I still felt like they were there, right in front of me, and I couldn't fight them. But something about that moment kept me going. I grabbed 2 Reds Bull. Was it an attempt to regain some energy or just a habit? Maybe just a desire to hide from myself for a few more minutes. I was drawn to the exit. I was not here. I was somewhere far away, in another world. It seemed that everything I saw and everything I did became part of the same emptiness in which I had lived for the past months. Soon the door creaked and a muffled ringing sounded, and this brought me back to reality. My foot finally stepped outside, but the world was the same, dead and empty. When I looked up, there she was, Alice. It was as if she was the spark that could bring color back to this dead place. Her gaze was quick and determined, like the wind rushing through everything. Her hair swayed slightly like a candle flame as she entered my world, and I felt everything around me become a little less dim. Her eyeliner, the light freckles hidden behind her casual smile, it didn't feel like it belonged here. But still, she was here. It wasn't like she was saving me. No, it was like a reminder that somewhere else, in another world, people were still alive. But I was still in this store, in this world. We were both here, and it wasn't an accident. I know that. She jumps up and tells me we're late. I try to focus. All I do is move. I take steps, turn my head, but inside it's like I'm not there. Alice is saying something, and I barely register her words. She keeps fidgeting, pushing me, but I needed time to stop. She doesn't wait for me to move at her pace. Why should I rush? When there are only shadows around, I pay for 2 drinks and struggle to follow her. Everything else is empty. We went outside. The wind was the same, but she was a spark, like a rare piece of light, and I had to go with her, past the dead trees in the wind, past those empty looks that still tried to catch me. But I went. And again, like an old photo, the world was simple. Unconsciously we moved, and I was ready to look at her, to look into the future. We moved along the road, leaving behind this strange store, as if burning away the traces of what we had just experienced. It seemed to me that I was no longer the same person who had entered it a few minutes ago. With each step, everything around became alien, despite its outward familiarity. Cars on the side of the road, abandoned houses, old road signs, all of this seemed so familiar, but at the same time, as if it did not exist. Alice walked beside me, her quick steps sometimes out of sync with mine. She looked at me curiously, as if trying to figure out something I was hiding. I could see her lips moving, but the sounds of her words just didn't reach me, lost in the noise in my head that was growing louder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes fixing on me with mild concern. I nodded, not even sure I could really answer. But somehow I couldn't just stay silent. "Yeah, I'm okay," I said, though the words were empty. Even the way I spoke was unnatural. My head felt like it was sinking into a viscous fog, and the world around me was losing its clarity. The road continued to wind, empty, with only a few passing cars, and it seemed to disappear somewhere in the middle of the forest. I could feel the cold creeping up on me, even though the air was warm enough. The whole place had a strange, frozen reality. It was as if time didn't exist here. I noticed how I hadn't been able to find a normal rhythm for several minutes now, my legs moving on autopilot, my mind in a daze. I allowed myself to look at Alice when she looked away, as if she sensed that I was trying to hide something. At one point, we both turned around and I noticed the light moving away, disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving us in the semi-darkness. It was so quiet around me that I could hear my heart beating in my chest. Even the sound of our footsteps was absorbed by the dense forest. I couldn't explain why, but there was something wrong in this forest. Maybe it was the old feeling that this place had forgotten people, leaving them here. Maybe that's why I felt like we weren't supposed to be here. "Why are you so silent?" Alice asked again. She couldn't understand what I was feeling, and I couldn't explain it to her. All the words I tried to find disappeared as soon as I started to say them. We came to a small clearing where the car was parked. Alice glanced at me quickly, as if trying to read my thoughts. "Wait here," she said, and then stepped toward the side of the road where an old, empty bench stood. She sat down on it, took something out of her bag, and began to write something quickly on a piece of paper. I didn't know why, but I didn't want to interfere. At some point, I felt as if we were separating. She was leading her thoughts, and I was left in my shadow, as if two worlds were running parallel, but not intersecting. I wanted to leave, to go further, but something kept me here. This place, these roads, these trees, everything around seemed somehow familiar, as if I had already been here. Suddenly, a thought came to my mind. Why don't we turn back? Maybe all this would be better if we returned home. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say, and so I just stayed there, looking at her figure in the distance. Alice with her papers, with her gaze at the sky, with this strange sense of distance between us. This place was taking us. We were moving on, but not toward a goal, not toward answers. We were going somewhere where there was no path, and so it went on. Time finally dissolved. Several hours passed. The sky, which had been bright and transparent at first, was now painted a gray-blue color. Time lost its meaning, as did our movement itself. We moved on, but as if in a circle, with no endpoint. It seemed that we were no longer walking, but floating in emptiness. I noticed that for a moment I couldn't feel my legs. Walking became mechanical, and the world around me became blurry. I wanted to stop, but Alice kept walking forward as if nothing was happening. I tried to catch up with her, but my steps seemed heavier and heavier. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't just keep walking. My eyes darted around, trying to find some explanation for this strange place. I stopped and looked at Alice. She was still the same, focused and confident, but an invisible wall had long since appeared between us. She didn't notice what I was feeling. She didn't notice how the world around me was changing. I could talk to her, ask her what was happening, but what would that change? Suddenly I saw it, the strange store I had forgotten about. It stood in the distance, on the edge of the forest, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Its walls were darkened, and the sign was barely visible, like a ghost of the past that didn't want to disappear. I felt a shudder run through my body, and despite my inner resistance, I took a step toward the store. Alice did not notice my move and continued on her way. It was strange. I had never been so absorbed in this place. Something about the store was drawing me. I could not explain why, but I knew that I had to go back there. Approaching the store, I noticed that the door, like last time, was slightly ajar. I could not believe that I was getting into this strange story again, but something inside me told me that this was not an accident. Entering the store, I saw the same seller standing behind the counter and his cold gaze, which immediately turned to me. "You are here again," he said, as if it was inevitable. I couldn't find the strength to answer. My mind was overloaded with questions, but I couldn't put them into words. Instead, I walked over to the shelf and began to look at the old books that were there. Their covers looked worn, as if they had survived centuries. I picked up one of the books and opened it, but there was no text inside. It was a blank book, the pages completely white. I felt a strange sense of anxiety wash over me, and I felt the dizziness begin again. Why? I could barely get the words out. The seller looked at me without changing his expression. "The questions you seek may be dangerous. Not all answers are worth knowing." His voice was even, but there was a hint of menace in it. I put the book down and looked at him again. My hands began to shake. I tried to resist, but my body seemed to be pulling me here, to this place where every cell felt like I belonged here, but I couldn't understand why. "What does this all mean?" I finally blurted out. The salesman raised his eyebrows as if my doubt had been expected. "Everything you seek is already within you. Questions, they merely open doors," he said, his voice deepening as if the words were an old mantra. I wanted to leave, but again I couldn't. I stood there feeling my thoughts gradually dissolving in this silence, as if they were becoming part of something much bigger. Suddenly I heard footsteps. Alice entered the store, her face tense, her eyes full of worry. "Did you find something?" she asked, looking around the space. I didn't know what to answer her, because I couldn't formulate a single intelligible word. Everything in this place seemed so wrong that I was no longer sure where reality ended and illusion began. And that was the moment I understood. We were both here for a reason. We were part of something bigger than we could have imagined. And the answers we were looking for were far more dangerous than we could have imagined. The store stood before me, frozen in time, and I couldn't figure out how exactly I had gotten here. I stood there, and the world around me moved in slow motion. The space here seemed to have its own rhythm, alien to my concept of time. Everything was so familiar and yet so strange that I couldn't believe that I was here, in this place again. I took a step forward, and its old wooden floors creaked as if welcoming me. The air smelled of dust and old books, and the light pouring through the dirty windows created soft, slightly distorted shadows. The walls of the store seemed infinitely high, and the shelves were overloaded with things that weren't supposed to be there. My hands began to rub together nervously, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the objects on the shelves. Each of them gave me a strange feeling, as if I knew them, even though I was seeing them for the first time. I approached one of the shelves and, without realizing it, began to sort through the books. Their pages were faded, the edges torn under my fingers. But when I opened one, the pages were blank, white, as if I were looking into an abyss. I couldn't understand why. Why would I want a book without words? Why did it even exist if it contained nothing? I was sure that something inside me should have an explanation, but there was no explanation. I took a step back, realizing that this store itself was strange, like a space between worlds. It was like a time trap, and I couldn't figure out how long I'd actually been here. Everything here felt wrong. Even the air I breathed wasn't fresh. It was thick, as if I was trying to inhale something that didn't exist. Suddenly, I felt a chill run through me, even though there was no hint of frost in the air. I tried to look around, but the shelves began to turn into blurry shapes, as if they did not exist at all. I did not know where the beginning and end of this place was, and the further I stayed in it, the more I felt myself starting to lose the very essence of reality. I no longer felt the floor beneath my feet, only some strange, invisible pressure that forced me to move on. At that moment, I realized that I did not know where I was. Maybe I was not in a store at all. Maybe I was trapped in a trap created by my own thoughts, which was shrinking around me with every step. But why did this place feel so familiar? Why did I feel like it had long become a part of me? I clenched my teeth, trying to force myself to understand what was happening, but my thoughts were confused, giving no clear answer. Everything seemed like one big mirage, and every step only brought me closer to even greater ignorance. I approached the exit, and the door, as before, was slightly open. I didn't know if I would be able to find myself here again, or if I would even leave this place. I stepped into the void, but instead of getting into the familiar reality, everything around me began to change again. There was no sound, no light. The world I had gone to was no longer real. I found myself in a void where there was no time, no space, no memory of what had happened before. Everything seemed an illusion, and I no longer knew how to get out. I stood motionless, aware that I was in an unknown space between worlds. Where I was, what I was, and who I was now. These questions made no sense. I just stood there, not knowing what would happen next. I didn't know how much time had passed when I began to feel a strange warmth around me. Suddenly, as if the space was alive, I felt the ground beneath my feet again. But it was different now. I wasn't standing on the wooden floor of a store, but on cold stone covered in moss. Dark corridors stretched out everywhere, full of ancient figures creeping along the walls, as if they were parts of forgotten tales. It was silent around me, but in this silence I felt a strange tension. My steps echoed in the emptiness, but they left no traces. The corridors I walked through seemed endless. The whole place was like a huge labyrinth, where every turn led to the unknown. I didn't know how I got here, but the feeling was strong, as if I had always been here. Every place I passed was familiar, but I couldn't remember where I was from. Were these memories or illusions? I tried to go back, but the corridors seemed to change, as if unwilling to let me find my way back. I began to notice paintings on the walls. They were faded and barely visible, but as I got closer, the images became clear. They were scenes from my past, but not as I remembered them. These paintings showed me, but in a different light. I saw myself in places I had never been, with people I had never met. I stepped forward to get a better look at one of the paintings. It was me, but in different clothes at a different age, in a different place. There were unfamiliar faces all around me, faces that seemed to be watching me, as if they knew that I would become a part of this world. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling away. These weren't my memories. They were foreign to me, and everything around me seemed even more ridiculous. As soon as I turned, a figure appeared in front of me. It was a woman, but her face was blurred, as if covered in fog. She stood at the end of the hallway, looking straight at me. "You're here," her voice echoed, as if she were speaking across millennia. I froze in place. She didn't move, but her presence was inescapable, and it was hard to break away from her gaze. There was something ancient in her eyes, something I couldn't understand. It was as if they had seen my entire life, including the parts I didn't remember. Who are you?" I asked, not understanding what was happening. The woman didn't answer right away. She took a step forward, and suddenly everything around me began to sway. The corridors began to bend, the walls shifted, and the figures in the paintings began to come to life, as if their lines were drawn not with paints, but with the very essence of time. "You're looking for answers," she said, coming up to me. "But there are no answers here. There is only what you are ready to understand." I felt her words penetrate my consciousness. Memories flashed in my head, but they were not my memories. It was like a dream where I saw myself, but in another body, in another time. I don't understand," I said again, not knowing what to think. The woman touched my hand, and I felt her touch disappear like a shadow. Everything in this world was shaky, and I could not hold on to a single memory, a single thought. Everything was disappearing, slipping away from me. "Everything will be clear when you go out," she said, and her voice disappeared, dissolving into the labyrinth. And then, when her figure disappeared, the space around me began to blur. My memory returned to me, but these were no longer the memories I knew. I was in a place that did not exist, and I realized that I could never return home. It was hard for me to comprehend exactly what was happening around me. This place, this space, with its strange, confusing passages and dark corridors, seemed to dissolve me in itself, making me forget about time and what had happened before. Every detail in this place seemed familiar and at the same time completely alien. I was lost, but I could not return. It was like a journey in which I was not allowed to turn back. I continued walking, feeling the fog of uncertainty enveloping me. This whole story was like a scream into an empty desert. I had long since stopped looking for meaning in what was happening. Sometimes I thought I heard someone's footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, I could not distinguish anything in this strange and dark world. No sounds except my own breathing and the weight of my steps creaking on the damp stone. Sometimes the smell of mold or rot came in the air, like echoes, but I did not know where it was coming from. With every step, the air became heavier and heavier, and I felt its damp density pressing on my lungs. With difficulty, I continued to move forward. The feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something important did not leave me. Somewhere in the depths, among these endless corridors, was hidden the solution to what brought me here. But was it really a solution? Or was it all just another trick created by this strange, incomprehensible place to confuse me even more? I stopped at the next turn. A corridor covered in dark stains on the walls opened up in front of me. For a moment, I thought I recognized this area. There was something about this place that made me feel uneasy and, at the same time, calm. I could not explain this feeling. It did not give me peace, but at the same time, it made me move on. I took a step forward, then another. And suddenly, almost without noticing how, I found myself in a room where the walls were covered with strange symbols. I approached them and began to examine them carefully. They seemed to be part of some ancient language, but they were not familiar to me. I could not understand them, but inside me there was a feeling that I should understand them, that these signs were a key, that they were not random. Everything that was happening around me was part of something bigger. It was becoming increasingly difficult for me to remain calm. It seemed that I was getting closer to the solution, but I could not find the right words to express what was happening inside me. Something invisible was pulling me further, leading me deeper into this place. I did not know what awaited me around the next turn, but I kept going, having no other choice. As I walked deeper into this place, the feeling of emptiness began to dissolve, replaced by something more concrete. I felt everything around me changing. Literally, every cell in my body was reacting to it. I realized that I was on the brink of something important. But what was it? It became clear to me that I could no longer go back. Everything that had come before, everything I knew, no longer mattered. This place, these corridors and symbols, they were all a part of me. And I knew that if I stopped, I would never be able to get out. I kept going, each step into the unknown, each step in search of an answer. I didn't know when I had reached the end. But as soon as I felt myself standing in the very center of this strange, mysterious place, I realized that all my questions, all my searches, this whole unknown tyranny of time and space were part of one big, never-ending cycle. I stood here, and I knew that now I had to find a way to break it. But how? A long time had passed since I found myself in this place. It seemed as if these days, if you can call them that, had stretched out into infinity, and I had long since lost track of time. Once I had lived, felt, thought, and even dreamed. Now all these things seemed so far away, as if they were part of another life, and all that remained was a vague feeling that I had to go on, to search no matter what. No, everything around me was the same. The stained walls, the dark corners, the rustling sounds coming from far away. None of it changed, but each new experience made me feel my consciousness drifting further and further away from reality. I couldn't explain exactly what was happening. There was no clarity in my mind, only echoes of thoughts that changed and twisted with every step, every turn. As I moved forward, I saw nothing that could help me. It seemed like I was looking for something. But what exactly I was looking for, I didn't know. Was it knowledge, answers to my questions, or maybe liberation from this labyrinth itself? I didn't know. I just kept going. I kept going because I couldn't stop, because despite everything, I still hoped. Then I discovered a strange door that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was ancient, covered in a layer of dust, and had deep cracks along its sides, but despite all that, it was surprisingly strong. I approached it and felt a strange excitement that squeezed my chest. This was the first place that looked like an exit, but I knew that everything might not be as it seemed. With every move I made, the tension grew. I knew I had to open that door, but with each step I took, uncertainty washed over me. The fear I felt wasn't about what might be on the other side of that door. I was afraid of what I might find. What if what lay behind that door wasn't liberation, but an even greater distortion of reality? What if everything I'd experienced so far was just an illusion, an attempt to trap me? I put my hand on the handle and froze for a moment. A thought flashed through my mind. What if I don't open it? What if I stay here, in this place, forever? And yet I opened it. I couldn't stay. I couldn't continue living in this constant fear and uncertainty. I had to go, no matter what. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. There was a dark corridor unlike all the others. It didn't end in the usual shadow. It stretched on forever, and I knew that I was now entering something completely different. There was something about this place that I hadn't felt before, something that made me feel both excited and empty at the same time. Suddenly, images appeared before me. It was like a fog, but with each step they became clearer. At first, I couldn't understand what was happening. I saw faces, figures, lines that intertwined and disappeared, as if reality itself was elusive here. Moments from my life flashed and disappeared like mirages, and I could only watch. I realized that what stood before me was nothing more than a reflection of my consciousness. These images were my fears, my memories, my hopes and disappointments. They were a part of me, but they could no longer control me. I had not been ready to admit it until now, but now I understood. I was not looking for a way out, but for myself. With each step, I was getting deeper into these images, but suddenly they started to dissolve. I knew that if I continued, I would end up in complete darkness. And maybe that was the answer. Maybe the answer was to stop searching, to stop running from myself, and to let everything dissolve into emptiness. I didn't know what would happen next, but I wasn't afraid anymore.